The last rays of summer sun streamed through the grimy windows of the Broken Spoke Tavern, painting golden stripes across weathered floorboards as dust motes danced in the amber light. The establishment sat on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, a town small enough to be overlooked on most maps, but large enough to attract trouble, and trouble had indeed found it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Blackwood stepped through the battered swinging doors, her entrance marked only by the gentle creak of hinges and the sudden charged silence that fell over the room. She was neither tall nor imposing, a woman in her mid-30s with chestnut hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing a faded blue dress that had once been fine, but now bore the marks of hard work and harder years. A black shawl was draped over her shoulders despite the lingering heat, and around her waist, barely visible beneath the shawl, was a worn leather gun belt that seemed out of place against the modest fabric of her dress. 20 pairs of eyes tracked her movement, conversation dying as she crossed the threshold. The tavern had been rowdy moments before, filled with the cacophony of clinking glasses, bawdy laughter, and tall tales growing taller with each round of whiskey. Now, the only sounds were the soft tap of Eleanor's boots on wood and the distant, tinny notes of a poorly tuned piano from the back corner. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, sweeping the room with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to assess danger before it fully materialized. Her eyes, a striking shade of grey that appeared almost silver in certain light, catalogued each face, each posture, each hand that instinctively moved toward a weapon before thinking better of it. The bar's patrons were a mixture of locals, travellers, passing through on their way to somewhere better, and a particular group that had commanded the largest table in the center of the room. 7 men, their clothes finer than the rest, their laughter louder, their presence a weight that had pressed the other customers to the edges of the space. At their center sat Jackson Bryce, a man whose reputation had arrived in Redemption Creek well before he had. The leader of the Bryce gang had made a name for himself throughout the territory, robbing stagecoaches, clearing out bank vaults, and leaving a trail of bodies that the territorial marshals seemed perpetually one step behind. His auburn hair was slicked back beneath a black hat, his mustache meticulously groomed, his vest embroidered with silver thread that caught the light when he moved. Eleanor walked to the bar, each step deliberate, her back straight despite the weariness that seemed to cling to her like a second shadow. She didn't acknowledge the stares, didn't flinch at the tension that had drawn tight as a hangman's rope around the room. "Whiskey," she said to the barkeep, her voice quiet but clear, devoid of any tremor that might suggest fear. "Just one." The bartender, a man named Frank Miller, who had poured drinks in Redemption Creek long enough to recognize trouble before the first shot was fired, hesitated only briefly before reaching for a bottle. He placed a glass before her, amber liquid, catching the light as he poured a generous measure. "Are you passing through, ma'am?" Frank asked, keeping his voice low, his fingers lingering on the glass. Eleanor's lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. "No, I belong here." Those 4 words, spoken softly but with unmistakable conviction, carried across the suddenly quiet room. Jackson Bryce paused mid-conversation, his head turning toward the bar like a predator catching an unexpected scent. "Well now," he drawled, pushing back his chair and standing with a theatrical flourish. "That's mighty interesting, because I've been in this fine establishment for 3 days now, and I don't recall seeing you around." Eleanor didn't turn immediately. She lifted the glass to her lips, took a measured sip, and set it down carefully before acknowledging Bryce's comment. "I've been away," she said simply, finally turning to face him, "burying my husband." Something flickered in Bryce's eyes, not sympathy, not regret, but a momentary calculation. He recovered quickly, offering an exaggerated bow that drew chuckles from his men. "My sincere condolences, ma'am," he said, the words dripping with false courtesy. "Losing a man is a terrible burden for a delicate woman to bear alone." The tavern had grown so quiet that the soft creak of floorboards beneath shifting feet seemed unnaturally loud. The locals, those who had lived in Redemption Creek long enough to know both Eleanor and the man she had buried, began to edge toward the doors, faces tight with awareness of what might follow. "It's a burden I carry just fine," Eleanor replied, her tone unchanged, betraying neither offense nor appreciation for his feigned sympathy. "Though I'd prefer to carry it in peace." Bryce exchanged glances with his men, his smile widening to reveal teeth too perfect to belong to an honest man. He approached the bar with exaggerated casualness, his spurs jingling with each step, creating a rhythm that seemed deliberately designed to grate on already frayed nerves. "Peace is a rare commodity these days," he mused, stopping close enough that Eleanor could smell tobacco and expensive cologne. "Especially for a widow woman all alone." He gestured around the tavern. "This world ain't kind to those without protection." Eleanor took another sip of her whiskey, her movements unhurried. "And I suppose you're offering protection?" Bryce laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Smart as well as pretty, I like that." He leaned against the bar, positioning himself between Eleanor and the exit. "As it happens, my associates and I are in the business of ensuring the safety of this fine community, for a modest contribution, of course." Frank Miller had gone very still behind the bar, his hands no longer polishing glasses, his knuckles white against the wooden counter. Outside, the sunset had deepened, throwing longer shadows across the tavern floor as the last golden light retreated. "The Blackwood Ranch doesn't require your brand of protection," Eleanor said, setting her glass down with a finality that suggested the conversation was over. For a moment, Bryce's smile faltered, the practiced charm slipping to reveal something colder underneath. Then he threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing off the rafters. "The Blackwood Ranch?" he repeated, turning to his men with theatrical incredulity. "Boys, did you hear that? This little lady thinks she can run the Blackwood spread all by her lonesome." His men obliged with laughter, though several glanced at each other with expressions that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the direction this was taking. The Blackwood name carried weight in these parts, or it had, before Thomas Blackwood's death 2 weeks prior. The ranch was one of the largest in the territory, and there had been whispers about what would happen to it now that its owner was in the ground. "I don't think," Eleanor corrected him, her voice still level, despite the growing tension. "I know." Bryce's amusement vanished like morning dew under a harsh sun. He straightened, squaring his shoulders, no longer bothering with the veneer of civility. "A woman has no business running land that size," he stated flatly. "Sooner or later, you'll come to your senses and sell. Only question is whether you'll get a fair price or be forced to take whatever's offered." Eleanor finished her whiskey in a single swallow, set the glass down, and stood. She was a full head shorter than Bryce, but something in her posture, a stillness that came not from fear but from absolute control, made the difference seem inconsequential. "Mr. Bryce," she said, using his name for the first time, confirming what he had suspected, that she knew exactly who he was. "I'm not selling the ranch. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." She reached into her pocket and placed a coin on the bar for her drink. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." She moved to step around him, but Bryce shifted, blocking her path. His smile had returned, but it no longer contained even the pretense of warmth. "I don't think you understand how this works, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "You see, I've already made arrangements with the bank in Silverlight. Your husband left quite a few debts behind, and they're coming due." It was a lie, and both of them knew it. Thomas Blackwood had been many things: stubborn, hard-working, occasionally reckless, but never a man who couldn't pay his debts. Still, banks could be persuaded to call in loans prematurely, especially when influence and money changed hands beneath tables. "Funny," Eleanor replied. "Mr. Holloway at the bank assured me just yesterday that all our accounts are in good standing." She met his gaze directly. "Perhaps you should check your sources." A muscle twitches in Bryce's jaw, the only sign that her response had caught him off guard. One of his men, a tall figure with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stood and approached, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "Everything all right, boss?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Just fine, Barrett," Bryce answered, his gaze still locked with Eleanor's. "Mrs. Blackwood and I are having a civilized discussion about her future." "My future is not up for discussion," Eleanor stated firmly, stepping to the side again. Only to find Barrett now blocking her as well. The atmosphere in the tavern had grown thick enough to choke on. The few remaining patrons were frozen in place, unwilling to leave, but equally unwilling to intervene. Frank Miller had disappeared behind the bar, perhaps reaching for the shotgun he kept mounted beneath the counter. "I think it is," Bryce countered, his voice hardening. "You see, I've taken a special interest in your property. That water access alone is worth twice what the land is." His smile twisted into something ugly. "I'm prepared to be generous, given your situation. But my generosity has limits, Mrs. Blackwood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in her eyes. A fleeting calculation, the barest narrowing that suggested she was reassessing her options. "I'd advise you to step aside, Mr. Bryce," she said calmly. "I've had a long day, and I have no desire to extend it further with this pointless conversation." Bryce snorted, glancing at Barrett with mock astonishment. "Do you hear that, Barrett? The widow's giving me orders in my own establishment." "Last I checked," Eleanor corrected him, "Frank Miller owned the Broken Spoke." "Ownership is such a fluid concept," Bryce replied with a dismissive wave. "Frank and I have come to an understanding about certain business matters. Haven't we, Frank?" From behind the bar came a grudging grunt that might have been agreement or might have been resignation. "Now," Bryce continued, turning his attention back to Eleanor, "I think it's time we discussed your situation like reasonable adults. My offer won't be open indefinitely, and believe me when I say you won't like the alternatives." Eleanor's hand moved beneath her shawl, quick and fluid. The metallic click of a revolver being cocked echoed like a thunderclap in the silent tavern. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Bryce's face split into a grin, and he erupted into laughter, his men joining in a moment later. "Would you look at that, boys?" he exclaimed between guffaws. "The widow thinks she's a gunslinger." Barrett chuckled, shaking his head as if witnessing the antics of a child. "Careful with that thing, ma'am. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Eleanor didn't flinch at their mockery. The revolver remained steady in her hand, its barrel pointed past Bryce toward the far wall, deliberately not aimed at any person. "Yet, this is your last warning," she said, her voice calm despite the escalation. "Step aside." Bryce wiped at his eyes, his laughter subsiding into occasional chuckles. "Or what? You'll shoot up the place? Come now, Mrs. Blackwood, we both know you're not the type." Without shifting her gaze from Bryce, Eleanor adjusted her aim slightly and fired. The shot cracked through the tavern, deafening in the enclosed space. A bottle on the shelf behind the bar exploded in a shower of glass and amber liquid, precisely the one Bryce had been drinking from all evening. In the ringing silence that followed, Eleanor's voice was soft but perfectly clear. "That was a warning, Mr. Bryce. The next one won't be." Bryce's jovial expression had vanished. replaced by something cold and calculating. He studied Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time, not as an obstacle to be brushed aside, but as a potential threat to be neutralized. "You've made a serious mistake," he said quietly, all pretense gone from his voice. Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. "The only mistake would be continuing to stand in my way." For a long moment they stood in tableau, the widow with her smoking gun, the outlaw with his hand hovering near his holster, the crowded room holding its collective breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, Bryce stepped aside. "This isn't over," he promised, his voice low enough that only Eleanor could hear him. "No," she agreed, moving past him toward the door, her revolver still drawn. "It isn't." She backed out of the tavern, keeping her eyes on Bryce and his men until she reached the boardwalk outside. Only then did she holster her weapon and turn away, walking with measured steps down the darkening street. Inside the broken spoke, Jackson Bryce watched her go, his expression unreadable. "What now, boss?" Barrett asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over the gang. Bryce's lips curled into a smile that contained no humor whatsoever. "Now," he said softly, "we find out everything there is to know about the widow Blackwood." He turned to his men, his decision already made, "and then we take what's ours." As night fell over Redemption Creek, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Eleanor Blackwood mounted her horse and rode toward the ranch that bore her name, unaware that the warning shot she had fired with such precision had only delayed the storm that was coming. The Blackwood ranch house stood silhouetted against the rising moon, its solid timber frame a dark shadow against the star-filled sky. Eleanor dismounted in one fluid motion, her boots crunching on the gravel of the yard as she led her chestnut mare toward the stables. The property was quiet, too quiet for her liking. Normally, even at this hour, there would be sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of horses, perhaps even the soft conversation of ranch hands finishing their day's work. Tonight, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the tall pines that flanked the eastern boundary and the soft hooting of an owl somewhere in the darkness. Eleanor's hand rested on her revolver as she approached the main house, her senses alert. The confrontation at the broken spoke had left her nerves raw, not from fear, but from the certainty that Bryce wouldn't leave matters as they stood. Men like him couldn't abide being challenged, especially not by a woman they'd already dismissed as inconsequential. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, the familiar sound oddly comforting in the stillness. Inside, a single lamp burned low on the sideboard, casting long shadows across the main room. Eleanor had left it lit when she'd ridden into town, a habit she couldn't bring herself to break. Thomas had always insisted on leaving a light burning, claiming it kept the darkness at bay. "Miss Eleanor?" A voice called from the kitchen, followed by the appearance of a grey-haired man with stooped shoulders and eyes that had seen more than their fair share of hardship. Samuel Parker had been the Blackwood foreman for over 20 years, loyal first to Thomas and now to his widow. "Didn't expect you back so late." "Change of plans, Sam," Eleanor replied, removing her shawl and draping it over a chair. "Where are the hands?" Samuel's weathered face creased with concern. "Send most of them to the north pasture. That fence line needed mending before we moved the herd." He studied her expression, reading the tension there with the ease of long familiarity. "Something happened in town." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered it anyway, pouring herself a small measure of whiskey from the decanter on the sideboard. "Jackson Bryce happened." Samuel stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the old Colt he carried on his hip despite his advanced years. "The outlaw? He's in Redemption Creek?" "With his entire gang," Eleanor confirmed, taking a small sip of the amber liquid. "He's made it clear he has designs on our land." "Vultures," Samuel muttered, his voice thick with disgust, hardly waited for Thomas to be cold in his grave. Eleanor set her glass down with a soft clink. It was never about Thomas, Sam. It's about water rights. Whoever controls the North Fork of the river controls half the grazing land in the territory. She moved to the window, peering out at the darkness that had swallowed her property. Bryce is just the first. There will be others. What happened when you encountered him? Samuel asked, his tone suggesting he already had some idea. The ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. I may have put a bullet through his favorite bottle of whiskey. Samuel's burst of laughter was genuine, but short-lived. I'd have paid good money to see his face. The humor drained from his expression. But he won't take that lightly, Miss Eleanor. Men like Bryce, they don't forget slights. I'm counting on it, Eleanor replied, turning from the window to face her foreman. I want you to send word to the hands at first light. Everyone is back. To the main ranch by noon tomorrow, and Sam— She hesitated, weighing her next words carefully. Tell them to come armed. Samuel nodded, accepting the order without question, though concern etched deeper lines around his eyes. They won't back down, will they? No, Eleanor answered honestly. They won't. She crossed to the heavy oak desk that had been Thomas's. Pride, imported all the way from St. Louis at considerable expense, and unlocked the bottom drawer with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. From within, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, placing it reverently on the desk's polished surface. With practiced movements, she unwrapped the bundle to reveal a pair of matched Colt revolvers, their silver inlay catching the lamplight. They had belonged to Thomas, custom-made by a gunsmith in Kansas City, each bearing the Blackwood brand engraved on the grip. Samuel watched in silence as Eleanor checked each weapon methodically, her fingers moving with the surety of long practice. Thomas insisted I learn, she said quietly, answering the unasked question in the foreman's eyes. Said a woman alone on the frontier needed to be able to defend herself. A shadow passed over her face. He never imagined it would come to this. He'd be proud of you standing your ground, Samuel offered, his voice gruff with emotion. Thomas never gave an inch when he believed he was in the right. Eleanor's hands stilled on the revolvers. It got him killed, Sam. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of grief still fresh and raw. Thomas Blackwood's death had been ruled an accident, a fall from his horse during a storm, his neck broken on impact, but Eleanor had never believed it, not fully. There had been too many threats in the weeks leading up to his death, too many accidents that seemed deliberately engineered. We don't know that for certain, Samuel replied cautiously, though his tone suggested he harbored the same doubts. No, Eleanor conceded, resuming her inspection of the weapons. We don't. But I won't make the same mistake he did. I won't underestimate what men like Bryce are capable of. A floorboard creaked outside, the sound barely perceptible, but enough to freeze both occupants of the room. Eleanor's hand moved to one of the revolvers, lifting it smoothly as she turned toward the door. Miss Eleanor, Samuel whispered, drawing his own weapon. Back door, go now. But before either could move, the front door burst open with enough force to splinter the frame. 3 men rushed in, guns drawn. Eleanor recognized Barrett immediately, his scarred face contorted in a triumphant grin. Behind him came 2 more of Bryce's gang, their weapons trained on Eleanor and Samuel. Well now, Barrett drawled, kicking the door shut behind him. Ain't this cozy? Eleanor's revolver was pointed steadily at Barrett's chest, her aim unwavering despite the sudden intrusion. You're trespassing on private property, she stated, her voice betraying none of the fury that coursed through her. I suggest you leave. While you still can. Barrett laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. I don't think you understand the situation, Mrs. Blackwood. We ain't here for a social call. He gestured with his gun. Put that down before someone gets hurt. Samuel had positioned himself slightly to Eleanor's left, his own weapon raised. 3 against 2, he observed dryly. Not great odds for you boys. One of the other men, a thin, wiry figure with a patchy beard and nervous eyes, snorted. "Old man, you're half blind and she's a woman. You really think you stand a chance?" Eleanor didn't spare the speaker a glance, keeping her focus on Barrett. "Where's Bryce? I wouldn't have taken him for a coward who sends others to do his dirty work." Barrett's expression darkened. "Boss is handling other business." His smile returned, uglier than before. "But he sent specific instructions about how to deal with you." "I'll bet he did," Eleanor replied, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. She had expected retaliation, but not so soon, not so boldly. "Sam, how many rounds do you have?" "Enough," the old foreman answered grimly. Barrett's patience visibly thinned. "This ain't a negotiation," he snapped. "Drop the guns or we start shooting." Outside, the sound of approaching horses broke the tense standoff. Barrett's eyes flickered. Toward the window, momentary confusion crossing his features. This wasn't part of the plan. Eleanor seized the distraction. In one fluid motion, she dropped to one knee and fired, her shot striking the lamp on the sideboard and plunging the room into darkness. The crash of breaking glass was followed immediately by the deafening report of multiple gunshots. Muzzle flashes illuminated the room in staccato bursts, briefly revealing figures ducking for cover. "Sam!" Eleanor called, crawling toward the desk for shelter. "Are you hit?" A grunt from her left answered in the affirmative. Just winged me," Samuel managed, his voice tight with pain. "The side door, Miss Eleanor, go!" Barrett's voice cut through the chaos, issuing orders to his men. "Find her! Don't let her get out!" Eleanor reached the desk, her hand finding the second revolver she had left there. Armed with both of Thomas's Colts, she weighed her options. The side door Samuel had indicated led to the kitchen and then out to the back porch. It offered the most direct escape route, but also the most predictable. Barrett would have anticipated it. Instead, she moved toward the window behind the desk, keeping low. Outside, the sound of horses had grown louder, accompanied now by raised voices. Reinforcements had arrived, but for which side remained to be seen. The window latch gave way easily under her fingers. Eleanor pushed it open as quietly as possible, the night air rushing in, cool against her face. She could make out shadowy figures in the yard, the gleam of moonlight on gun barrels. "Barrett!" a voice called from outside. Jackson Bryce himself, his tone sharp with anger. "What the hell is happening in there?" The momentary distraction was all Eleanor needed. She slipped through the window, landing in the soft dirt of her wife's flower bed. Keeping to the shadows cast by the house, she edged toward the corner, the revolvers heavy in her hands. From her new vantage point, she could see Bryce and 4 more of his men in the yard, their attention fixed on the house. They hadn't spotted her yet, but it was only a matter of time. The stable offered the nearest cover, but reaching it meant crossing open ground. Before she could decide on her next move, the front door of the house banged open and Barrett emerged, dragging Samuel by the collar of his shirt. The foreman's left arm hung limp, dark with what could only be blood. "Boss," Barrett called, shoving Samuel to his knees, "we have a problem." The widow slipped out. Bryce dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. In the moonlight, his face was a study in controlled rage. "You had one job, Barrett, one simple job." "She was ready for us," Barrett protested, gesturing with his gun toward the injured foreman. "Had this old-timer with her, both of them armed." Bryce approached Samuel, looking down at the wounded man with contempt. "Where is she?" he demanded. Samuel spat at Bryce's boots, his weathered face defiant despite the pain etched into every line. "Go to hell!" Bryce's response was swift and brutal, the butt of his revolver connecting with Samuel's temple in a blow that echoed in the quiet night. The foreman crumpled to the ground, unconscious or worse. "Find her," Bryce ordered, his voice ice-cold. "Tear this place apart if you have to. She doesn't leave this property alive." Eleanor felt a white-hot fury rise within her at the sight of Samuel's treatment. The foreman was family, the closest thing to a father figure she had left in this world. The urge to step out from her hiding place and confront Bryce directly was almost overwhelming, but she forced it down. Rushing in would only get her killed, and then there would be no one left to protect the ranch or to avenge Samuel. Instead, she continued her cautious movement toward the stables, staying in the deepest shadows. If she could reach her mare, she might have a chance of breaking through Bryce's men and reaching the neighboring ranch for help. She had nearly made it to the stable when a soft voice spoke from directly behind her. "Don't move, Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor froze, the revolver still clutched in her hands. She hadn't heard anyone approach, a testament to the speaker's stealth. "Turn around," the voice continued, real slow-like. Eleanor complied, pivoting carefully to face the barrel of a rifle held by a man she didn't recognize. He was younger than the others, perhaps no more than 20, with sandy hair and a face unmarked by the hard living that characterized most of Bryce's gang. But his eyes were cold, and his grip on the rifle was steady. "You're making a mistake," Eleanor told him quietly, making no sudden movements despite the weapons in her hands. "Bryce isn't here for me. He's here for the water rights. Once he has what he wants, do you think he'll share the spoils with someone like you?" Uncertainty flickered across the young man's features. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mom. I'm just following orders." "Orders to murder a widow on her own land?" Eleanor pressed, watching him closely for any sign that her words were having an effect. "Is that the kind of man you want to be?" The rifle wavered slightly. I didn't sign up for killing women. Just told us we were collecting a debt." Eleanor took a calculated risk, lowering one of her revolvers to her side. "What's your name?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Ethan," he answered after a brief hesitation. "Ethan Mills." "Well, Ethan Mills," Eleanor said, maintaining eye contact, "you have a choice to make right now, because I promise you, if you call out to Bryce, one of us isn't walking away from this, and I don't intend for it to be me." Ethan's gaze flicked toward the yard, where Bryce was issuing orders to the rest of his men. Some had already begun searching the outbuildings, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. "He'll kill me if I let you go," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to Eleanor. "Not if he doesn't know you found me," Eleanor countered, her mind racing. "Listen to me, Ethan. My foreman is injured out there. Help me get him to safety, and I'll make sure you walk away from this." The internal struggle played out across Ethan's young face, fear, doubt, a flicker of conscience. For a long moment, Eleanor thought she had lost the gamble. Then, with a muttered curse, Ethan lowered his rifle. "I must be out of my mind," he whispered. "What's your plan?" Eleanor felt a surge of relief, though she kept it from showing on her face. "The stables," she replied, nodding toward the building behind her. "There's a back exit that leads to a trail through the pines. If we can get Samuel, we can slip away without being seen." Ethan shook his head. "Too risky. They're watching the yard too closely." He glanced around, thinking quickly. "But there's a distraction we could use." "What kind of distraction?" Ethan nodded toward the weathered barn that stood opposite the stables. "That thing looks like it hasn't seen a fresh coat of paint in a decade. One spark and it'll go up like kindling." Eleanor's eyes widened as she grasped his suggestion. "You want to burn my barn?" "Just as a distraction," Ethan insisted. "Fire that size in the dark. Everyone's attention will be on it, including Bryce's. That gives us a chance to grab your man and make for the trees." Eleanor weighed the proposal, her practical nature warring with her attachment to the property Thomas had built. But Samuel's life was worth more than timber and hay. "Do it," she decided, "but wait for my signal. I need to get closer to Samuel first." Ethan nodded, a newfound determination in his eyes. "Be careful. Bryce is not a man who forgives betrayal." "Neither am I," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but implacable as she melted back into the shadows, leaving the young outlaw to prepare their distraction. As she edged closer to where Samuel lay motionless on the ground, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, buried beneath layers of anger and resolve, but it no longer controlled her actions. She had made her choice the moment she fired that warning shot in the broken spoke. Now she would see it through to whatever end awaited. In the yard, Bryce paced like a caged wolf, his patience visibly thinning as his men returned one by one with the same report. No sign of the widow. His boot connected with Samuel's ribs in a vicious kick that drew no response from the unconscious. "Man, she can't have gone far," Bryce snarled, his composed facade cracking under the strain of being thwarted. "Find her!" Eleanor clutched Thomas's revolvers tighter, the silver inlay cool against her palms. She had never intended to become a fighter, never wanted to stand against men like Jackson Bryce. But circumstances had forced her hand, much as they had forced her to learn to shoot with deadly accuracy in the first place. As she prepared to give Ethan the signal that would set their desperate plan in motion, Eleanor made a silent promise to Samuel, to Thomas, and to herself. When dawn broke over the Blackwood Ranch, it would still be hers, whatever the cost. The night air felt electric with tension as Eleanor positioned herself behind a water trough, calculating the distance to where Samuel lay unconscious. 20 yards of open ground, too far to cross without being spotted, even in the shadows cast by the moon. She needed that distraction now, as if reading her thoughts, a flickering orange glow began to illuminate the far side of the barn. Ethan had worked quickly. Within seconds, the dry timbers caught, sending flames licking up the weathered boards. The fire spread with alarming speed, casting wild, dancing shadows across the ranch yard. "Fire!" one of Bryce's men shouted, pointing toward the rapidly growing blaze. "The barn's on fire!" The effect was immediate. Every head turned toward the sudden conflagration, momentarily forgetting their search for the widow. Jackson Bryce himself stared at the flames, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion. "It's a distraction," he growled, turning back toward the yard. "She's—" His words cut off as Eleanor emerged from the shadows, both revolvers raised. She fired twice in rapid succession, her aim deliberate and precise. The first shot knocked the gun from Barrett's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. The second struck the lantern hanging from a post beside Bryce, showering him with glass and kerosene. The outlaw leader dove for cover, cursing as the flammable liquid soaked his expensive coat. His men scattered like startled birds, firing wildly into the darkness where Eleanor had already disappeared again, making her way towards Samuel. "Get that fire under control!" Bryce bellowed, wiping kerosene from his face with a silk handkerchief. "And find her, damn it!" Eleanor reached Samuel's side, dropping to her knees beside the injured foreman. Blood matted his grey hair where Bryce's gun had struck him, but his chest rose and fell steadily. He was alive. "Sam," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Sam, wake up!" The old man's eyelids fluttered, a groan escaping his lips. "Miss Eleanor?" "We need to move," she told him, sliding an arm under his shoulders to help him sit up. "Can you walk?" Samuel winced, his hand going to his wounded arm. Don't think I have much choice," he managed, his voice rough with pain. A shadow fell across them, and Eleanor whirled, a revolver instantly trained on the figure approaching through the smoke. Ethan Mills raised his hands, showing he meant no. "Harm! We need to go now," he urged, glancing nervously toward the spreading fire. "They're starting to get organized." Eleanor nodded, holstering one revolver to better support Samuel. "Help me with him." Together they half-carried the foreman toward the cover of the pine trees that bordered the property, staying low and using the smoke and confusion as cover. Behind them, the barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the night sky in a beacon visible for miles. Men shouted to one another, some attempting to contain the fire, others still searching for Eleanor. They had almost reached the tree line when a bullet kicked up dirt at their feet. followed by Bryce's voice, sharp with fury. "Stop right there! Widow Blackwood!" Eleanor turned to see the outlaw leader standing 20 paces away, his gun leveled at them. His hat was gone, his carefully groomed appearance disheveled, but the deadly calm in his eyes was unchanged. "Ethan," she said quietly, "get Samuel to the trees." The young man hesitated, looking between Eleanor and Bryce. "What about you?" "I'll handle this," she replied, her tone brooking no argument. "Go." Reluctantly, Ethan took Samuel's weight fully onto his shoulders and continued toward the trees, leaving Eleanor facing Bryce alone. She stood tall, one revolver still holstered, the other hanging at her side, not raised but ready. "You've made quite a mess of my evening, Mrs. Blackwood," Bryce observed, his voice deceptively conversational. "Destroyed property, wounded my men, turned one of my own against me." His gaze flicked toward Ethan's retreating form. "Young Mills will regret that decision." "He made the right choice," Eleanor countered. "Something you wouldn't understand." Bryce's laugh was cold. "And what choice do you think you have now? Your woman's barely conscious. Your barn is burning to the ground and you're outnumbered 10-1. He gestured with his free hand. "This ends one way." "You're right," Eleanor agreed, her eyes never leaving him. "It does." Her words seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment Bryce appeared almost wary, as if sensing a trap. "So you're finally seeing the reason. The ranch, the water rights, they're not worth dying for." "No," Eleanor said simply. "They're worth killing for." In the split second that confusion registered on Bryce's face, Eleanor moved. Her draw was lightning fast, the revolver coming up and firing before Bryce could react. The shot was precise, striking his gun hand. His weapon discharged harmlessly into the ground as it fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Bryce staggered back, clutching his bleeding hand, his expression a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You..." Eleanor's second shot cut off his words, the bullet passing so close to his ear that he felt the displacement of air. It wasn't a miss. It was exactly where she had aimed, a warning as deliberate as the one in the saloon. "That's twice I've let you live," she told him, both revolvers now trained on his chest. "There won't be a third time." From the burning barn came shouts as the rest of Bryce's men realized what was happening. Eleanor knew she had seconds before. They arrived before the odds became impossible even for her. "My property is off limits to you and your men," she stated, her voice carrying clearly despite the crackling of the flames. "Spread the word. The next outlaw who sets foot on Blackwood land goes home in a pine box." With those words hanging in the air between them, Eleanor backed toward the trees, keeping her revolvers trained on Bryce until the shadows swallowed her. Dawn broke over the neighboring Triple R ranch in pale bands of pink and gold. Eleanor sat on the covered porch, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands as she watched the first stirrings of activity in the ranch yard. Samuel rested inside, his wounds tended by Rachel Reed, the ranch owner's wife, and the closest thing to a doctor within 50 miles. The door opened behind her, and Matthew Reed stepped out, his weathered face creased with concern. The neighboring rancher had welcomed them without question when they'd arrived in the small hours of the morning, Samuel barely conscious, and Eleanor and Ethan exhausted from supporting him through the dense forest that separated the two properties. "How is he?" Eleanor asked, not taking her eyes from the horizon, where a thin plume of smoke still rose from the direction of her ranch. "Resting," Matthew replied, settling into the chair beside her. "Rachel says the bullet wound is clean, went straight through the muscle. His head took a harder knock, but Samuel Parker's got a skull like granite. He'll be as ornery as ever by sundown." Eleanor nodded, relief washing through her. "Thank you, Matt, for everything." The rancher waved away her gratitude. "Thomas would have done the same for me." He paused, studying her profile. "What happened out there, Ellie?" "The boy Mills told Rachel some of it, but..." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, grimacing at the cold bitterness. Jackson Bryce decided he wanted my water rights. I declined his offer. Matthew let out a low whistle. Bryce, the outlaw? He's got a reputation that would make the devil himself think twice. So I've heard, Eleanor replied dryly. He'll have a new story to add to that reputation now. The rancher's eyebrows rose. You stood against him? Alone? A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. Not entirely alone. Her expression sobered. But I made my position clear. Whether he respects it remains to be seen. And the boy? Matthew asked, nodding toward the bunkhouse where Ethan had collapsed into exhausted sleep hours earlier. Can he be trusted? Eleanor considered the question. Ethan Mills had surprised her, showing a conscience she hadn't expected from one of Bryce's men. He had risked everything to help her and Samuel escape, and that wasn't a debt she took lightly. Yes, she decided. He can. He's young, made some poor choices, but he's not cut from the same cloth as Bryce. Matthew nodded, accepting her judgment. Rachel's taken a shine to him already. Says he reminds her of our boy before he headed east for school. He cleared his throat, addressing the question Eleanor had been waiting for. What will you do now, Ellie? Your barn's gone, and Bryce won't take this humiliation lightly. Eleanor set her cup down, her decision already made. I'm going back, today. That's madness, Matthew protested, sitting forward in his chair. At least wait until Samuel's on his feet. I can spare some men to ride with you. The longer I stay away, the stronger the message that I can be driven off, Eleanor explained, her tone gentle but resolute. I need to be there when Bryce returns, and he will return. At least take Mills with you, Matthew urged, and I'll send word to Sheriff Hollister in Silverlight. It's time the law got involved. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that bore the calluses of ranch work, alongside the finer softness that spoke of her upbringing. Sheriff Hollister is a good man, but his jurisdiction ends at the town limits. Out here, we make our own justice. It was a harsh truth they both understood. The frontier had its own rules, its own brutal logic. Those who couldn't defend what was theirs lost it, to nature, to outlaws, to the relentless tide of progress that swept across the territory like a prairie fire. I'll check on Samuel before I leave, Eleanor added, moving toward the door. And Matt, don't tell him I've gone until I've had a head start. He'll try to follow, wounded or not. Matthew nodded reluctantly. You're as stubborn as Thomas ever was, he muttered, but there was respect in his voice. Be careful, Ellie. There are worse things than losing land. The weight of his words followed Eleanor inside, where she found Rachel Reed changing the bandage on Samuel's arm. The foreman was awake, his eyes clearer than they had been the night before, though deep bruising had spread across his temple where Bryce's gun had struck. There she is, Samuel said, attempting to sit up straighter and wincing at the effort. Told you she wouldn't leave an old man to fend for himself. Rachel shot Eleanor a knowing look. He's been fretting about you since he woke, as if you weren't the one who dragged him through 1/2 mile of forest in the dark. Eleanor smiled, the expression warming her normally reserved features. It's good to see you alert, Sam. How's the arm? It'll heal, the foreman dismissed, his gaze sharpening as he studied her. You're planning something, I can see it in your eyes. Same look Thomas got before he did something foolish. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. I'm going back to the ranch. Today. Samuel's reaction was immediate and predictable. The hell you are, not with Bryce and his men still out there. They won't be expecting me so soon, Eleanor reasoned. That gives me the advantage, and Ethan will come with me. That... Boy, Samuel scoffed. He's barely old enough to shave, let alone stand against the likes of Bryce. Eleanor laid a gentle hand on the foreman's uninjured arm. He saved your life, Sam, and mine. Give him a chance to prove himself. Samuel subsided, though his expression remained troubled. At least, wait for me to heal enough to ride. A few days, that's all I ask. "We don't have a few days," Eleanor replied softly. "You know as well as I do what happens to abandoned property in these parts. If I don't return immediately, there might not be a ranch left to defend." The truth of her words hung heavily in the room. Rachel continued her ministries in silence, respecting the gravity of the discussion. "Then you need to be prepared," Samuel finally said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Bryce won't come at you the same way twice. He'll be smarter, more cautious, and a cautious snake is twice as dangerous." Eleanor nodded, having reached the same conclusion during her sleepless night. "I know." "The old tunnel," Samuel suggested, referring to the abandoned mineshaft that ran beneath part of the Blackwood property, a relic from a brief, unsuccessful attempt at silver mining years before Thomas had acquired the land. "If things go bad, you can use it to get out, I remember," Eleanor assured him. The tunnel had been a source of endless fascination for her when she'd first arrived at the ranch as Thomas's bride, young and still adjusting to the harsh realities of frontier life. He had shown her the hidden entrance in the root cellar, explaining that on the frontier, an escape route could mean the difference between life and death. How prophetic those words seemed now. Rachel finished securing the fresh bandage and gathered her supplies. "I'll check on your young man," she said, tactfully giving them privacy. "Make sure he's ready to ride if that's what you're determined to do." When the door closed behind her, Samuel's weathered face grew more serious. "There's something else, Miss Eleanor. Something you should know before you go back." The formality in his address alerted her to the importance of what would follow. "What is it, Sam?" The foreman hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Thomas. He kept things from you. Thought he was protecting you, but—" He drew a labored breath. "There's a strong box hidden beneath the floorboards in your bedroom. Southwest corner under the rug. The key is in his mother's music box." Eleanor frowned, confused by this revelation. "A strong box? What's in it?" "Papers," Samuel replied. "Deeds, contracts, letters, things that explain why men like Bryce are so interested in Blackwood land." His eyes held hers steadily. Thomas knew they were coming. He tried to prepare in his way. A chill ran through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Are you saying his death wasn't an accident?" Samuel's silence was answer enough. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, a hint of anger coloring her tone. "He made me promise to wait," the foreman explained, regret evident in his voice. "Said if anything happened to him, I was to give you time to grieve before burdening you with the truth. But now with Bryce—" He shook his head. "You need to know what you're really fighting for." Eleanor stood, her mind racing with implications. The water rights were valuable, yes, but valuable enough to murder for? There had to be more, something she didn't understand yet. "I'll find the box," she promised, "and Sam—" She paused at the door, looking back at the man who had been her husband's most trusted friend, and was now hers. "Thank you for telling me now. Rest and heal. I'll need you back at the ranch soon." The foreman nodded, sinking back against his pillows. "Be careful, Miss Eleanor, and if you see Bryce—" "I know," she replied quietly. No more warning shots. Ethan Mills was waiting in the stable when Eleanor arrived, already saddling her mare. The young man looked different in daylight. Younger, less hardened than she had first thought. There was a wariness in his movements that spoke of a life spent looking over his shoulder, but also a determination that reminded her, oddly, of herself. "Mr. Reed said you're planning to go back," he said without preamble, tightening the cinch on her saddle. "Today." Eleanor adjusted her hat, checking that Thomas's revolvers were secure in their holsters at her hips. She had changed into riding clothes, practical trousers and a sturdy jacket that allowed freedom of movement. "That's right." Ethan continued his work, avoiding her gaze. "You know Bryce will come back with more men. He can't afford to let what happened stand. His reputation—" "I'm counting on it," Eleanor replied calmly, checking the saddlebags that Rachel had packed with provisions. "The question is, are you coming with me, or should I have Matthew arrange passage to somewhere Bryce won't find you?" The young man's hand stilled on the leather straps. "You're offering me a choice?" "Everyone deserves one," Eleanor told him, "even those who've made mistakes." Ethan turned to face her fully, his expression torn between hope and suspicion. "Why would you trust me? After everything Bryce and his men, everything we did to your ranch, to your foreman." "Because you made the right choice when it mattered," Eleanor answered simply. "And because I think you're tired of running." Something shifted in the young man's eyes, a weight lifting or perhaps a decision solidifying. "They'll call me a traitor, put a price on my head." "Probably," Eleanor agreed, not softening the truth. "So the question remains, what do you want, Ethan Mills? To keep running from men like Bryce, or to stand and fight for something that matters?" It was the same question she had asked herself in the dark hours after Thomas's death, when grief and fear had threatened to overwhelm her resolve. The answer then, as now, would define everything that followed. Ethan straightened, a new determination settling over his features. "I'm coming with you, Mrs. Blackwood." He managed a crooked smile. "Someone's got to watch your back." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. "Then we better ride. We've got a strong box to find and a ranch to reclaim before Bryce returns." As they mounted their horses and turned toward the path that would lead them back to Blackwood land, Eleanor felt a strange sense of clarity. The pieces were finally coming into focus. Thomas's death, Bryce's obsession with their property, the secrets her husband had kept to protect her. Whatever waited in that strongbox would change everything. She was certain of it. And this time, when Jackson Bryce returned, she would be ready with more than warning shots. The widow was done being underestimated. The journey back to the Blackwood Ranch took longer than Eleanor had anticipated. Rather than risk the main road, she and Ethan kept to game trails and creek beds, moving cautiously through the dense pine forest that separated the Reed property from her own. Twice they spotted riders in the distance and were forced to take cover until the threat passed. By the time they created the final ridge overlooking the ranch, the sun had begun its westward descent. Eleanor reined in her mare, surveying what remained of her property with a tightness in her chest that felt like grief. The barn was gone, nothing but a blackened skeleton of charred timbers and ash. The main house still stood, its weathered clapboards, untouched by the fire, but several windows had been broken. Even from a distance, she could see that the corrals had been damaged, fence posts splintered, and rails scattered across the yard. "They were thorough," Ethan murmured, drawing his horse alongside hers. "Looks like they left a few hours ago at least." Eleanor nodded, her gaze methodically scanning the property for signs of movement. "How can you tell?" "No horses in sight," Ethan replied, "and the fires burned down to almost nothing, just coals now." She glanced at him with newfound appreciation. Despite his youth, Ethan clearly possessed skills born of hard experience. "Think they left anyone behind?" "As a welcome." "Party?" The young man considered, eyes narrowed against the afternoon light. "If it were up to Barrett, yes. He likes to leave surprises." He pointed toward the stables, which had remarkably survived unscathed. "That would be my first choice for an ambush. But from here," he shook his head, "no tracks leading to or from it since the rain last night. I think we're alone." Eleanor trusted his assessment, but remained cautious nonetheless. "We'll approach from the south, use the creek bed for cover. If anyone's waiting, I want to be the one doing the surprising." They dismounted, leading their horses through the shallow stream that bordered the southern edge of the property. The water muffled the sound of hooves, while the bank provided concealment. As they drew closer to the house, Eleanor felt a growing certainty that Ethan was right. Bryce and his men had withdrawn, at least temporarily. The question was, Why? The ranch yard felt unnaturally quiet as they emerged from the creek bed. No chickens scratched in the dirt, no cattle bloomed in the nearby pasture. Even the persistent meadowlarks that typically heralded the approach of evening were silent. They took everything, Eleanor observed, her voice tight with controlled anger as they approached the stables. Livestock, chickens, probably anything of value in the house. Ethan didn't reply, but his expression hardened as he surveyed the devastation. This was more than theft or vandalism. It was a calculated attempt to render the property uninhabitable, to ensure that even if Eleanor returned, she couldn't sustain herself here. The stable doors hung open, revealing empty stalls where Thomas's prized quarter horses had been kept. Saddles, bridles, and tools were gone. Anything that could be easily carried and sold. Eleanor moved through the space with growing fury, mentally cataloguing each loss. "We should check the house," she finally said, turning away from the emptiness. "I need to find that strongbox." The main house had fared better than she'd expected, though not by much. Furniture had been overturned, drawers emptied onto floors, and cabinet doors left hanging open. Thomas's oak desk in the study had been broken apart, likely in search of hidden valuables. Eleanor moved through the rooms methodically, Ethan following a respectful distance behind. Despite the destruction, the structure itself remained sound, a testament to Thomas's craftsmanship. When he'd built it years ago, they were looking for something, Ethan observed, studying the precise manner of the vandalism. This wasn't just rage or spite, they were searching. Eleanor paused in the doorway to the bedroom she had shared with Thomas. "The strongbox," she agreed, "but they didn't find it." She gestured to the floorboards in the corner, still intact. Beneath an overturned rug, Samuel said southwest corner under the rug. Together they righted the bed and moved the heavy walnut wardrobe that had been pushed over the spot. Eleanor knelt, running her fingers along the edge of the planks until she found one that moved slightly under pressure. Using the blade of her hunting knife, she pried up the board, revealing a small compartment beneath. Just as Samuel had described, an iron strongbox lay wedged in the space, its surface dusty but undisturbed. Eleanor lifted it carefully, heavier than she'd expected, but not unmanageable. "Now for the key," she murmured, crossing to the mantelpiece where an ornate music box had remained untouched. Either Bryce's men hadn't recognized its value, or they hadn't bothered with something so seemingly insignificant. The melody that emerged when she lifted its lid was hauntingly familiar, a folk song Thomas's mother had brought from the old country. Eleanor tipped the music box, allowing a small brass key to slide from its hidden compartment into her palm. "Do you want privacy?" Ethan asked, gesturing toward the door. "I can keep watch outside." Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "Stay. Whatever's in here, I might need another perspective." She didn't add that she'd come to trust his judgment in the short time they'd known each other, or that the thought of facing Thomas's secrets alone left her uncharacteristically vulnerable. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside the strongbox lay several bundled documents, a small leather journal, and an official-looking envelope sealed with wax, bearing the territorial governor's stamp. Eleanor removed them carefully, spreading the contents across the bed. "Land deeds," she murmured, examining the first bundle. "Not just for our property, but for parcels all along the river." She frowned, scanning dates and descriptions. "Thomas was buying land for years before I even met him. Small parcels, different names, but all connected to the water." Ethan picked up a surveyor's map, yellowed with age but meticulously annotated. "These markings—" He traced a line that ran beneath several properties, including the Blackwood Ranch. "I've seen maps like this before. When I was a boy, my father worked the silver mines near Garrison." Eleanor looked up sharply. "You think there's silver on our land? That's what Bryce is after?" Ethan shook his head slowly. not silver. He pointed to notations in the margin, written in Thomas's distinctive, and these symbols, they're not marking silver deposits. His expression grew serious. Mrs. Blackwood, I think your husband found oil. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Oil, more valuable than silver, more coveted than gold in the rapidly industrializing nation. If Ethan was right, the Blackwood property wasn't just prime grazing land with good water access. It was sitting atop a fortune that could reshape the entire territory. Eleanor opened the sealed envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a contract, bearing both Thomas's signature and that of the territorial governor. The legal language was dense, but the essence was clear. Thomas Blackwood had secured exclusive mineral rights to a vast tract of land, far beyond the boundaries of their ranch, in exchange for certain considerations to be paid to the territorial government. He knew, Eleanor whispered, pieces falling into place, all those trips to the capital, the meetings he wouldn't discuss. He was securing our future. Her voice caught. And someone killed him for it. Ethan watched her carefully, concern evident in his young face. If Bryce knows about this, he does, Eleanor interrupted, picking up the leather journal. Or at least suspects. Listen to this. She read from an entry dated 3 weeks before Thomas's death. R approached again. Today with an offer for the north section. When I declined, pleasantries gave way to veiled threats. I didn't mention the survey results or the governor's contract. R has connections with B and his gang of thieves. Best they believe it's just about the water rights for now. R, Ethan mused. Richard Reynolds, Eleanor nodded grimly, owner of the largest ranch in the territory and chairman of the Territorial Bank in Silverlight. She continued reading. He thinks I should sell before matters escalate, but what kind of legacy would that leave? This land isn't just soil and grass, it's the future. Our future. I've taken precautions, documented everything in case the worst happens. S knows where to find this if I'm not here to explain myself. She closed the journal, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions beneath her composed exterior. S must be Samuel, and E, Ezekiel Harris, a deep voice supplied from the doorway. Eleanor and Ethan spun, weapons drawn in a single fluid motion. A tall figure leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed casually over a worn leather vest. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and a beard streaked with white. A brass star gleamed on his chest, partially obscured by the duster he wore. Marshal Harris, Eleanor acknowledged, lowering her revolver but not holstering it. You're a long way from your usual territory. The federal marshal tipped his hat. Mrs. Blackwood, heard there was trouble out your way. His weathered face revealed nothing as his gaze shifted to Ethan. Mills, last I saw, you were riding with Bryce's outfit. Interesting change of company. Ethan tensed, but kept his gun lowered. People can change, Marshal. So they say, Harris replied neutrally, stepping into the room. His eyes fell on the documents spread across the bed, and something like resignation crossed his features. I see you found Thomas's insurance policy. Eleanor studied the lawman carefully. You knew about this? Some, Harris admitted. Not the extent of it. Thomas kept his cards close. He gestured to the journal. That entry you were reading, he thinks I should sell. That would be me, Ezekiel Harris. Your husband and I go back a long way, Eleanor, further than you know. The use of her first name, unusual from the typically formal Marshal, underscored the personal nature of the connection. Eleanor remembered Thomas mentioning Harris occasionally, always with respect, though she'd had the impression their relationship was strictly professional. How long have you known about oil? She asked directly. Harris moved to the window, positioning himself to watch the yard while they talked, the instinctive caution of a man who had survived decades enforcing the law in unforgiving territory. Thomas had suspicions 3 years ago, after that unusually dry summer when the creek bed exposed unusual rock formations. He consulted a geologist friend from back east, very discreetly. The marshal's voice was matter of fact. Confirmation came about 18 months ago. That's when he started buying up connecting parcels through third parties. And when Richard Reynolds began pressuring him to sell, Eleanor added, the timeline aligning with her memories of increasing tension in her husband's manner. Harris nodded. Reynolds has powerful friends, railroad interests, Eastern money. When Thomas refused to sell, they started applying different kinds of pressure, like hiring Bryce to intimidate him, Ethan suggested. Bryce is just the muscle, Harris corrected. The real threat comes from men who wear suits and sit on bank boards. He turned back to Eleanor. I warned Thomas that these people play by different rules. That's when he created this. He gestured to the strongbox and secured the governor's support through that mineral rights contract. Eleanor picked up the contract again, scanning its provisions more carefully. The governor agreed to protect our claim. For a percentage, Harris noted dryly. Politics hasn't changed much since the Garden of Eden. But yes, it's legal and binding. As long as you can hold onto the land until the terms are fulfilled, your rights are secure. And if I can't? Eleanor asked. Though she already suspected the answer, the marshal's expression hardened. Then Reynolds and his associates will find a way to claim it, legal or otherwise. Thomas's death was just the beginning, the blunt confirmation that her husband had indeed been murdered, not by accident or misadventure, but deliberately, struck Eleanor with physical force. She had suspected, had even prepared herself for the confirmation, but hearing it stated so plainly by a lawman of Harris's standing made it irrefutably real. Do you have proof? She asked quietly. Harris's hesitation was answered enough. Nothing that would stand in court. Reynolds is too careful for that. And Bryce knows how to make murder look like bad luck. The frustration of a lawman constrained by the very system he served was evident in his tone. That's why I'm here unofficially. My jurisdiction doesn't technically cover these parts. Ethan, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. If you're not here officially, what exactly are you offering, Marshal? It was a bold question from a young man with questionable legal standing, but Harris seemed to appreciate the directness. Information, for starters, he replied. Bryce and his men have set up camp at the old Wilkinson place, about 5 miles east. They're expecting reinforcements, hired guns from as far as Wyoming territory, according to my sources. Reynolds is sparing no expense. When? Eleanor asked. 3 days, maybe 4. They're gathering quite the army. Harris paused, choosing his next words carefully. Eleanor, the smart play here is to leave. Take what proof you have to the territorial capital, file formal charges, let the system work. She almost laughed at the suggestion. The system let Thomas be murdered without consequence. It stood by while Bryce terrorized this town. Now you expect me to trust it with justice? I expect you to survive, Harris countered, his tone sharpening. Thomas didn't want this fight to become yours. That's why he kept you in the dark, why he made arrangements with the governor. He wanted to protect you. And yet here I am, Eleanor observed coldly, sorting through the wreckage of his secrets and facing the consequences he tried to shield me from. Harris had no response to that truth. Instead, he changed tack. The Reeds sent word that Samuel Parker is recovering at their place. From what they described, you're down to yourself and young Mills, here against at least 15 seasoned gunmen. His gaze swept the ransacked room. They've already shown what they can do to your property. Next time they won't leave the house. Standing! Eleanor began gathering the documents, carefully returning them to the strongbox. I'm aware of the odds, Marshal, and I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. This is my home, my legacy. I won't be driven from it." For a moment, Harris studied her with an unreadable expression. Then something shifted in his weathered face. Recognition, perhaps, of the same stubborn determination that had characterized his old friend Thomas. "Then you'll need more than information," he said finally, his decision apparently made. "You'll need a plan and help." He glanced at Ethan. "No offense to Mills, but 2 against 15 isn't a plan. It's suicide." "What do you suggest?" Eleanor asked, sensing the marshal wasn't simply offering advice he expected her to ignore. Harris settled his weight against the bedroom wall, arms crossed as he considered their options. "First, we secure the property, what's left of it. Establish defensive positions, inventory whatever weapons and ammunition you have. Then we send reinforcements of our own." "From where?" Ethan questioned skeptically. "The nearest lawmen are in Silverlight, and they answer to the same bankers backing Reynolds." "Not lawmen," Harris clarified. "Friends. Thomas wasn't without allies in these parts." He glanced at Eleanor. "Did he ever mention the Calloway brothers?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not that I recall. Former Texas Rangers. Retired to a small spread, north of here about 5 years ago. They owe Thomas a debt from the war." Harris straightened, decision made. "I'll ride out tonight. Bring them in. Between them, myself, and whatever men the Reeds can spare, we might just make Bryce reconsider his approach." "And if he doesn't?" Eleanor pressed. The marshal's smile held no warmth. "Then, Mrs. Blackwood, we'll find out if those warning shots of yours were practice or restraint." As the evening shadows lengthened across the ravaged ranch yard, Eleanor stood on the porch watching Harris ride out, his figure gradually disappearing into the growing darkness. Beside her, Ethan worked with quiet efficiency, boarding up broken windows with salvaged lumber. "Do you trust him?" the young man asked without pausing in his work. Eleanor considered the question. Ezekiel Harris had been an enigma throughout. Her marriage, a name Thomas mentioned with respect but revealed little about. Now he had appeared at precisely the moment she discovered the truth about her husband's death, offering both confirmation and assistance. "Thomas trusted him," she replied finally. "For now, that's enough." Ethan nodded, accepting her judgment. "What's our first priority?" Eleanor surveyed the property, mentally cataloguing needs against resources. "Food and water we can manage. The smokehouse is intact and the well wasn't damaged. Weapons." She touched the revolvers at her hips. "We have these, plus whatever Harris brings back." "And defensive positions," Ethan added. "The house is solid, but we're exposed on too many sides. We need to create choke points, control their approach." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the charred remains of the barn, an idea forming. "Sometimes destruction can be useful," she mused. "Those timbers create a natural barrier, if we reinforce them." As darkness fell completely, they worked by lantern light, converting the wreckage of her property into a defensive perimeter. The physical labor provided a welcome distraction from the weight of revelations. Thomas's secretive land acquisitions, the oil beneath their feet, Reynolds' deadly ambition, and the gathering storm of violence heading their way. Later, as they sat at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal cobbled together from the smokehouse provisions, Eleanor found herself studying her unlikely ally. Ethan Mills had transformed from enemy to defender in the span of a day, risking his life for a woman he barely knew, against men who would show no mercy if they captured him. "Why did you join Bryce's gang?" she asked abruptly. Ethan paused, a spoonful of beans halfway to his mouth. For a moment, she thought he might evade the question, but then he set the spoon down with deliberate care. "My father died in a mining accident when I was 15, he began, his voice matter-of-fact. "Company claimed it wasn't their fault and refused compensation. My mother got sick that winter, consumption, no money for medicine. His shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. Bryce's men were recruiting, promised good money, adventure. By the time I realized what I'd signed up for, it seemed too late to walk. Away! The simple narrative contained volumes of unspoken pain and regret. Eleanor heard in it echoes of countless young men who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law through desperation rather than malice. "And now?" she asked quietly. "After this is over, assuming we survive, what then?" Ethan's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time she saw something like hope in his young face. "Honest work, if anyone will have me. A fresh start, somewhere my name isn't known." Eleanor nodded. Decision made. "If we hold this ranch, when we hold this ranch, there will be a place for you here, Ethan Mills. This land was meant to be a legacy. Perhaps it can be one for both of us." The offer clearly caught him by surprise. He stared at her for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity or pity. Finding none, he straightened in his chair, something fundamental shifting in his bearing. "Then we'd better make sure we're still here to claim it," he said simply. As the night deepened around the battered Blackwood ranch, Eleanor felt an unexpected sense of clarity. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the odds stacked against them in ways that would have seemed insurmountable just days ago, yet she had found allies where she least expected them, in a repentant outlaw, a federal marshal with mysterious ties to her husband, and soon, perhaps, in the former Texas Rangers that Harris had gone to summon. Moreover, she had discovered a reserve of strength within herself that Thomas might have seen all along, even as he tried to shield her from the harsher realities of their situation. Tomorrow would bring preparations for war. Tonight, Eleanor. Blackwood allowed herself a moment of resolve as she cleaned Thomas's revolvers one final time, no longer as his widow, but as the defender of everything they had built together. And when Jackson Bryce returned with his army of hired guns, he would find not a grieving woman ready to surrender, but a fortress prepared for battle. Dawn broke over the Blackwood ranch in ribbons of pale gold and lavender, illuminating the results of Eleanor and Ethan's night of labor. What had been random destruction now formed a deliberate defensive perimeter. Charred timbers from the barn, repositioned as barricades, overturned wagons creating cover near the house. Even the water trough moved to provide protection for anyone. Approaching from the stables, Eleanor stood on the porch, Thomas's brass spyglass in hand, as she scanned the eastern horizon. No sign yet of Marshal Harris or the reinforcements he had promised. She tried to quell the doubt that crept in with the morning light, doubt that help would arrive in time, doubt that even with help they could withstand the force Bryce was assembling. Behind her, the door creaked open as Ethan emerged, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The young man looked tired but alert, his sandy hair damp from washing up at the pump. "Anything?" he asked, handing her one of the mugs. Eleanor shook her head, collapsing the spyglass with a practiced motion. "Nothing yet." Ethan leaned against the porch railing, blowing across the surface of his coffee before taking a careful sip. "The marshal said it might take until midday to reach the Calloway place and bring them back. We still have time." Time. For what? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "To reconsider," Ethan replied frankly. "The documents are secure. We could still take them to the territorial capital, press your case through legal channels." Eleanor's lips curved in a humorless smile. "You sound like Harris." "Maybe he has a point," Ethan persisted. "We've made this place as defensible as possible with what we have. But the reality is—" "The reality," Eleanor interrupted, her tone gentle despite her firmness, "is that if I leave now, I'll never get this land back. Reynolds and his associates will manufacture some legal pretext to seize it before I can even reach the capital." She turned to face him fully. "This isn't just about justice for Thomas anymore. It's about standing against men who believe their money and influence put them above the law." Ethan studied her face, searching for any sign of uncertainty. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Then we keep preparing." They spent the morning conducting a thorough inventory of their resources. The house's root cellar yielded preserved vegetables and dried meat that had escaped Bryce's initial raid. A hidden compartment in the stable floor, covered by a false panel, revealed a cache of ammunition Thomas had wisely kept separate from the guns in the house. Most valuable of all was the discovery of 4 sticks of dynamite wrapped in oilcloth behind a loose stone in the fireplace, a relic from Thomas's brief attempt at expanding the abandoned mine tunnel years earlier. "This could be useful," Ethan observed, carefully examining the explosives to ensure they were still stable. "Set in the right location, it could funnel their approach exactly where we want it." Eleanor nodded, impressed again by the young man's tactical thinking. Despite his youth, Ethan possessed an instinctive understanding of defensive strategy that belied his years. The northern approach would be best, she decided. The creek bend creates a natural bottleneck. If they're forced to come in from the south instead, they'll have to pass between the stable and the house, Ethan finished. Perfect crossfire position. By midday, they had transformed the Blackwood Ranch from a vulnerable homestead into a surprisingly formidable defensive position. Anyone approaching would be forced to navigate a carefully designed gauntlet with minimal cover and maximum exposure to fire from the house and stable. Eleanor was checking the sight on one of Thomas's hunting rifles when the sound of approaching riders caught her attention. She and Ethan exchanged a quick glance before taking up prearranged positions, Eleanor inside the house with a clear view of the yard, Ethan in the stable loft covering the approach. Through the window, Eleanor counted 5 riders cresting the ridge. Leading them was Marshal Harris, his distinctive duster visible even at a distance. Beside him rode 2 older men who could only be the Calloway brothers, their matching grey beards and ramrod-straight posture marking them as the former Texas Rangers Harris had described. The 4th rider was Samuel Parker, his left arm in a sling, but otherwise looking remarkably recovered for a man who had been unconscious just a day earlier. The final figure took Eleanor a moment to recognize, Matthew Reed, their neighbor, carrying what appeared to be a shotgun across his saddle. She signaled to Ethan with a short whistle, the all-clear they had agreed upon, before stepping onto the porch to greet their reinforcements. Harris dismounted first, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile as he surveyed their defensive preparations. "Well now," he remarked, "it seems you two haven't been idle." "Miss Eleanor," Samuel called, awkwardly dismounting with one arm. "Told them you'd be getting ready rather than running." The pride in the foreman's voice was unmistakable. Eleanor helped Samuel stable his horse, noting with concern how the short ride had taxed his strength, despite his attempts to hide it. "You should have stayed at the Reeds to recover," she admonished, gently. "My place is here," Samuel replied with simple dignity. "Always has been." Harris introduced the Calloway brothers, Emmett and Jasper, with the concise efficiency of a man accustomed to command. Both men tipped their hats to Eleanor with old-fashioned courtesy that didn't quite mask the assessment in their eyes as they took in the preparations she and Ethan had made. "Thomas spoke highly of you," Emmett, the elder of the two, remarked. "Said you had more grit than most men he'd known." His gaze swept the yard, noting the strategic placement of barriers. "Seems he wasn't exaggerating." "High praise coming from him," Jasper added, unloading additional rifles from his packhorse. "Your husband saved our lives at Shiloh. Never got the chance to repay that debt." His expression hardened. "Until now." Matthew Reed approached last, extending a bundle wrapped in canvas. "Rachel sent provisions," he explained, "and these—" He unwrapped the package to reveal a pair of Remington revolvers. "They were her father's. Said you might find better use for them than we would." Eleanor accepted the weapons with appropriate gravity. Please thank her for me. With their group assembled, they gathered in the house to discuss strategy. Harris spread a roughly drawn map on the kitchen table, marking their position and the likely approach Bryce would take. My sources confirm they're planning to move tomorrow at first light, the marshal informed them. 17 men total, including Bryce and Barrett. They've hired guns from as far as Dakota Territory, not just thieves but killers. His finger traced the main road leading to the ranch. They'll expect us to focus our defense here at the front approach, which is why we've already redirected our strategy to the north and south, Eleanor explained, outlining the preparations she and Ethan had made. The dynamite at the creek bend will force them to split their forces or funnel entirely to the south. The Calloway brothers exchanged impressed glances. Jasper leaned forward, studying the map with the focus of a career military man. If we position men here and here, he suggested, marking spots on the crude diagram, we create overlapping fields of fire. Anyone coming through will be caught in the crossfire. 6 against 17, Matthew observed grimly. Still not great odds. 5, Samuel corrected, gesturing to his injured arm. I can reload, but my shooting days are temporarily behind me. Emmett Calloway's weathered face creased in a slow smile. Quality over quantity, Mr. Reed. I've seen 2 good men hold off 20 with the right position and enough determination. He nodded toward Eleanor. And determination doesn't seem to be in short supply here. They spent the afternoon refining their plans, positioning ammunition caches and establishing signals. The Calloway brothers, drawing on their ranger experience, suggested modifications to the barricades that would provide better cover while maintaining clear lines of sight. As evening approached, Harris took Eleanor aside while the others continued preparations. There's something else you should know, he said quietly, leading her into Thomas's study where they wouldn't be overheard. Something I couldn't say in front of the others. Eleanor tensed, bracing for more bad news. What is it? The marshal removed his hat, running a hand through his iron-grey hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. Your husband and I were more than acquaintances, Eleanor. We were brothers in arms, and before that, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Before that, we were family. Eleanor stared at him, trying to make sense of this revelation. Family. Thomas never mentioned having any living relatives except his mother, and she passed before I met him. Not by blood, Harris clarified. By choice. He reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing a faded tintype photograph that he handed to Eleanor. The image showed 3 young men in Union Army uniforms, arms thrown around each other's shoulders. Thomas stood on the right, impossibly young and solemn. Harris was in the middle, recognizable despite the decades that had passed. The third man was a stranger to Eleanor, handsome, with a roguish smile that contrasted with the formality of his pose. That's me, Thomas, and Michael Blackwood, Harris explained. Thomas's cousin. We grew up together in Pennsylvania, enlisted the same day when the war broke out. His voice grew softer. Michael didn't make it home. Took a Confederate bullet. At Cold Harbor. Eleanor stared at the image, trying to reconcile this piece of her husband's past with the man she had known. Thomas had rarely spoken of his time in the war, and never in detail. Why are you telling me this now? Harris took back the photograph, his thumb brushing over the faces with unexpected tenderness. Because you need to understand why I'm here. It's not just about the law or even about friendship. He met her gaze directly. Thomas Blackwood was the finest man I ever knew. When Michael died, Thomas put aside his own grief to keep me from drowning in mine. After the war, when the nightmares were so bad I couldn't close my eyes, he sat up with me night after night until dawn broke. The marshal's voice, normally so controlled, wavered slightly. When he wrote to me about the oil, about Reynolds's threats, I tried to convince him to sell, to take the money and build somewhere safer, Regret etched deeper lines around his eyes. I should have come sooner. Maybe if I had... You can't know that, Eleanor said quietly. Thomas made his choices. Yes, Harris agreed. He did. He chose to build something that would last, something that mattered. His expression hardened. That's why Reynolds won't stop. It's not just about the oil or the money. Men like him can't abide someone standing against them, denying them what they want. It becomes personal. Eleanor considered this, understanding dawning. Just as it's personal for you now. And for you, Harris added. Bryce and his men will come at dawn, expecting to find a widow they can intimidate or eliminate. Instead, they'll find us waiting. The lawman replaced his hat. Decision made. I couldn't save Thomas, but I can help save what he built. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the others make final preparations. The Calloway brothers worked with the efficient precision of men long accustomed to preparing for battle. Matthew, Reed and Ethan were setting up additional firing positions in the stable loft, while Samuel, despite his injury, insisted on inspecting every aspect of their defenses. Marshal Harris emerged from the house to join her, his expression thoughtful. As he surveyed their small force, having second thoughts? Eleanor asked, noting his pensive demeanor. Harris shook his head, remembering. Been a long time since I stood with men preparing for a fight we might not win. Do you think we can win? She pressed, wanting honesty rather than reassurance. The Marshal considered the question with appropriate gravity. It's not about numbers, it's about determination and position. He glanced at her. And sometimes it's about having something worth fighting for. Eleanor nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. This land represented more than property, or even the valuable resources beneath it. It was Thomas's legacy, his dream of building something lasting in this harsh, beautiful territory. Now it has become her purpose as well. There's something I've been wondering, she said after a moment. The journal mentioned Thomas took precautions, documented everything. But the strongbox only contained land deeds and the contract with the governor. If he was gathering evidence against Reynolds, Harris's expression sharpened. You think there's more? I think Thomas was too thorough to leave anything to chance, Eleanor replied, especially if he suspected his life was in danger. The marshal considered this, his gaze distant as he thought back. There might be something. Thomas mentioned a safety deposit box at the Silverlight Bank last time I saw him. Said he was keeping important papers there, separate from the ranch. Papers Reynolds couldn't access, despite his influence with the bank, Eleanor realized. We need to retrieve them. After, Harris insisted. First, we deal with Bryce and his men. Then we take whatever evidence exists to the federal authorities, not the territorial officials Reynolds has in his pocket. Eleanor accepted this logic, though the thought of waiting even longer for justice chafed. Tell me about Michael, she said instead, redirecting the conversation. Thomas's cousin. What was he like? A smile softened the marshal's weathered features, bright, fearless, could charm the scales off a snake. He chuckled at some distant memory. Thomas was always the serious one, planning, thinking 3 steps ahead. Michael lived in the moment. Together they balanced each other. Like brothers, Eleanor murmured. In every way that mattered, Harris confirmed. After Michael died, Thomas carried that loss like a physical weight. I think that's part of why this land meant so much to him. It was the future Michael never got to see. Eleanor felt a deepening connection to her husband's past, to the young man in the tintype who had experienced loss and emerged determined to build something meaningful. I wish he had told me these stories himself. Thomas kept his ghosts close, Harris replied with understanding. "But I know he found peace here, with you. Even at the end, when he sensed danger closing in, he never regretted his choices." Across the yard, Ethan approached, interrupting their conversation with an apologetic nod. "Marshal, Mr. Calloway wants your opinion on the placement of the dynamite." Harris excused himself, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts as twilight deepened into dusk. She found herself pondering the layers of her husband's life that were only now being revealed. The young soldier who had lost his chosen brother, the determined man who had envisioned a dynasty, the husband who had tried to protect her from harsh realities. Ethan remained after the marshal departed, his presence quietly supportive. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting her pensive expression. "Just learning that even after years of marriage, there are parts of Thomas I never knew," she replied honestly. The young man considered this. "I think that's true of everyone. We all have pieces we keep hidden, even from those closest to us." "What about you?" Eleanor asked, curious. "What pieces have you kept hidden, Ethan Mills?" He smiled wryly. "Nothing as noble as your husband's secrets." His expression grew more serious. "But I understand why he kept certain things from you. There's a kind of protection in not knowing sometimes." Eleanor shook her head. "There's also a vulnerability in ignorance. If I had known what Thomas was facing—" She left the thought, unfinished, unwilling to indulge in fruitless speculation about how things might have been different. As darkness fell completely, they gathered around the kitchen table for a simple meal. Conversation was sparse, each person occupied with their own thoughts about the morning to come. The Calloway brothers cleaned their weapons with methodical precision. Samuel dozed in Thomas's old chair, his injured arm cradled against his chest. Matthew Reed wrote a letter by lamplight, presumably to his wife. Harris caught Eleanor's eye across the table, nodding subtly toward the porch. She followed him outside, where the night air carried the scent of pine and sage. "I've been thinking about what you said," the marshal began without preamble, "about Thomas possibly leaving additional evidence somewhere." Eleanor waited, sensing he had more to say. "The abandoned mine tunnel," Harris continued. "Samuel mentioned it as a possible escape route, but knowing Thomas—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "During the war, he had a talent for hiding crucial information where no one would think to look. If he wanted to preserve evidence against Reynolds, somewhere neither Bryce nor bank officials could access it. The tunnel would be perfect." Eleanor finished, the idea resonating with what she knew of her husband's methodical nature. "We should check it tonight, before Bryce arrives." Harris nodded. "My thoughts exactly. But it should be just you and me. The others need rest before morning." Eleanor agreed, returning inside briefly to retrieve a lantern and her revolvers. She caught Ethan's questioning glance and gave a reassuring nod, indicating she wouldn't be long. The entrance to the abandoned mine shaft was hidden in the root cellar, behind shelves of preserved food. Eleanor moved these aside to reveal a crude doorway cut into the earth and reinforced with timber. The air that greeted them was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of mineral-rich soil. "Thomas sealed this years ago when we realized there was no silver to be found," she explained, lighting the lantern. "We only reopened it as an emergency exit after the first threats came." Harris ducked through the low entrance, his hand reflexively moving to the revolver at his hip, a lawman's instinct in unknown territory. "How far does it extend?" "About a quarter-mile before it branches," Eleanor replied, leading the way. "The main shaft eventually collapses, but the southern branch runs beneath the creek and emerges near the old lightning-struck oak. Thomas mapped it all when we first bought the property." They moved cautiously through the narrow passage, the lantern casting distorted shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Occasional wooden supports creaked ominously overhead, reminders of the tunnel's age and questionable stability. "If Thomas hid anything here, where would it be?" Harris asked, his voice low in the confined space. Eleanor considered, trying to think as her husband would have. Not in the main shaft, too obvious, and not near the entrance or exit. She paused, recalling a detail from their explorations years earlier. There was a side chamber about halfway down the southern branch. Thomas always seemed interested in it, though it was just a dead end. They continued in silence, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. At the fork, Eleanor turned south, the passage narrowing further as it descended slightly. After another 100 yards, she slowed, raising the lantern higher. "Here," she murmured, illuminating a small opening to their right. The side chamber was little more than an alcove carved into the rock, perhaps 6 feet square. At first glance it appeared empty, just bare walls and a packed earth floor, but Eleanor remembered Thomas's methodical nature, his attention to detail. The floor, she realized, kneeling to examine it more closely. It's been disturbed. Harris crouched beside her, his experienced eyes quickly noting what she had seen, a section of earth that had been dug up and replaced, the difference subtle, but unmistakable to those looking for it. Together, they excavated the spot, digging down about 2 feet before striking something solid. Eleanor brushed away the remaining soil to reveal a metal box similar to the strong box they had found in the bedroom, but smaller. "This has to be it," Harris murmured, helping her lift it from its hiding place. Unlike the bedroom strongbox, this one had no lock, just a simple latch. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, several folded documents, and most surprisingly, a Colt revolver wrapped in oilcloth. Eleanor removed the journal first, opening it to find Thomas's distinctive handwriting. It was dated 2 months before his death, and from the first page it was clear this was no ordinary record of ranch business. "I write this account with the full expectation that it may someday serve as evidence of crimes committed against me, and others who have stood in the way of Richard Reynolds' ambitions." Harris leaned closer, reading over her shoulder as Eleanor turned pages, documenting meetings, threats, and eventually explicit evidence of Reynolds' connection to Bryce's gang. "This is what we needed," the marshal breathed. "Names, dates, details of payments between Reynolds and Bryce. Thomas was building a case." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Even facing danger, Thomas had remained methodical, determined to ensure justice would eventually prevail, with or without him. She turned to the folded documents, finding affidavits from 2 former Reynolds employees who had witnessed illegal activities, along with bank records showing suspicious transactions. Finally, she unwrapped the revolver, instantly, recognizing it as Michael Blackwood's service weapon, the one visible in the tin-type photograph Harris had shown her. Engraved on the barrel were the initials MB, along with a date. April 9th, 1865, the day of Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. "Michael's gun," Harris confirmed, his voice hushed with recognition. "Thomas carried it through the rest of the war after Cold Harbor. I never knew he still had it." Eleanor rewrapped the weapon carefully. "He must have wanted it preserved, along with the evidence." "A fitting guardian," Harris observed. "Michael always stood for what was right, no matter the cost." He helped Eleanor gather the contents back into the box. "With this evidence, we can bring Reynolds to justice through proper channels, after we deal with Bryce." As they made their way back through the tunnel, box of evidence secured, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. Thomas hadn't just been protecting land or oil rights. He had been building a case against corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial power. Now it fell to her to complete what he had started. By the time they emerged from the root cellar into the kitchen, the others had settled in for the night, taking turns at watch. Ethan looked up from where he sat cleaning one of the Remington revolvers, his expression questioning. "Found something?" he asked quietly, noting the box in Eleanor's hands. "Thomas's insurance policy," she replied. "But it'll keep until morning." Eleanor secured the box alongside the other documents in her bedroom, then joined Ethan on the porch for the first watch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. In the distance, an owl called, its mournful cry, echoing across the silent ranch. "Dawn's only a few hours away," Ethan observed, his young face solemn in the moonlight. "You should get some rest." Eleanor shook her head, her gaze fixed on the eastern horizon where Bryce and his men would appear. With the sun, "I'll rest when this is finished." Together they sat in companionable silence, watching the night slowly give way to the first hint of grey on the horizon, harbinger of the day that would decide the fate of Blackwood Ranch, and all who now stood in its defence. The first hint of dawn painted the horizon in delicate strokes of pink and gold, the stars fading into the brightening sky. Eleanor stood at the bedroom window, watching as night surrendered to day. In the yard below, Marshal Harris and the Calloway brothers were already in position, their figures barely visible in the pre-dawn light as they made final adjustments to the defensive perimeter. She had changed into practical attire, a dark riding skirt and Thomas's old shirt, her hair secured in a tight braid that wouldn't impede her vision. Thomas's revolvers hung at her hips, their familiar weight, both comfort and burden. On the bedside table lay the contents of both strongboxes, organized and ready to be transported if the coming conflict went poorly. Evidence of oil beneath Blackwood land, documentation of Reynolds's illegal activities, the contract with the territorial governor. Together they represented not just Eleanor's claim to the property, but a case that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the territory. If they survived the morning, a soft knock at the door drew her attention. Samuel stood in the doorway, his weathered face solemn in the dim light. "They're ready," he informed her. "Marshal says it's time." Eleanor nodded, gathering the papers and returning them to the smaller strongbox. "Are you certain you won't reconsider leaving with these?" she asked, not for the first time. "If something happens to all of us, the evidence needs to reach the federal authorities." Samuel's expression remained stubborn. "My place is here, Miss Eleanor, always has been." His good hand rested on the doorframe, knuckles white with tension. "Besides, ain't nothing going to happen to you folks. Not today." The bravado didn't quite mask the worry in his eyes. They both knew the odds they faced. Outgunned, outnumbered, with only their preparation and determination to level the field. "At least stay inside," Eleanor insisted. "You can watch the approaches from the second-floor window. With that arm, you'd be a target anywhere else." After a moment's hesitation, Samuel nodded his agreement. Whatever argument he might have made was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Ethan appeared behind the foreman, his expression grim. "Dust on the eastern road," he reported. "Still too far to count riders, but it's them." Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment all their preparations had built toward, the moment that would determine the future of Blackwood Ranch and everyone who now stood in its defense. "I'll be right down," she told them, needing a final moment alone. When they had gone, Eleanor opened the top drawer of the bureau and removed a daguerreotype in a simple silver frame. Thomas looked back at her from behind the glass, his expression serious, but with that hint of warmth in his eyes that had first drawn her to him. The portrait had been taken on their wedding day, his normally practical attire replaced by a formal suit, his beard neatly trimmed for the occasion. "I wish you were here," she whispered to the image, "but I promise you this, I will not let them take what we built, not without a fight." She replaced the portrait carefully and moved to the window once more. The rising sun now illuminated the yard clearly, revealing their defensive preparations in stark detail. The charred timbers from the barn had been reinforced with additional lumber to create barricades. Overturned wagons provided cover near the house. The water trough had been positioned to shield anyone moving between the house and stable. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Downstairs, she found the others gathered in the kitchen for a final briefing. Marshal Harris stood at the head of the table, his weathered face composed but alert. "They're taking the main road," he confirmed, tracing the route on the crude map they had drawn. "At their current pace, they'll be here in 20 minutes, maybe less." Emmett Calloway, the elder of the two brothers, cleaned his spectacles with methodical precision before replacing them on his nose. Despite his age, Eleanor guessed he was nearing 60. His hands were steady, his movements economical. "How do you want to play this, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, deferring to her with the respect of a man who recognized authority regardless of gender. "It's your land, your call." Eleanor appreciated the gesture, conscious of the decades of experience represented by the men around her. "We stick to the plan. Dynamite at the creek bend to funnel them south. Jasper and Marshal Harris in the stable loft for high ground. Emmett and Matthew at the barricades for crossfire. Ethan and I will cover the house." "And if they breach our perimeter?" Matthew Reed asked the practical question of a man who had survived on the frontier by anticipating worst-case scenarios. "The house is our fallback position," Eleanor replied. "Thick walls, defensible windows, clear lines of sight. If needed, there's the tunnel as a last resort." Jasper Calloway loaded cartridges into his revolver with practiced efficiency. "Won't come to that," he stated with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced worse odds and emerged victorious. "These hired guns may be killers, but they're not soldiers. When the lead starts flying, half of them will break and run." "Don't underestimate Bryce," Ethan cautioned, "or Barrett. They've faced resistance before and come out on top." "Not like this, they haven't," Emmett replied with a hint of grim humor. "Not against Texas Rangers, a federal marshal, and a woman who can shoot the spots off a playing card at 50 paces. The compliment caught Eleanor by surprise. She hadn't realized the brothers had been observing her practice shots the previous evening. Before she could respond, Marshal Harris straightened, his posture shifting subtly. "They're coming," he announced, though no sound yet reached them. "Everyone to positions. Remember, no shooting until they cross the creek. We want them committed before they realize what they're riding into." The kitchen emptied quickly as each person moved to their assigned location. Eleanor checked the loads in both revolvers one final time before taking up position at the front window of the house. From here, she had a clear view of the yard and the approach from the south. Ethan stationed himself at the side window, covering the western approach. His young face was set in lines of concentration, all traces of uncertainty gone now that the moment of action had arrived. "Ethan," Eleanor said quietly, catching his attention, "whatever happens, I want you to know I'm grateful. You could have ridden away yesterday, started fresh somewhere else, that you chose to stay." She left the thought unfinished, but the meaning was clear. The young man nodded, a small smile ghosting across his features. "Some things are worth fighting for, Mrs. Blackwood." He checked the sight on his rifle. Some people, too. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, the sun climbing above the eastern ridge to illuminate the landscape in crisp detail. Birds had fallen silent, as if sensing the approaching conflict. The only sounds were the occasional creak of timber as the defenders shifted position and the distant growing rumble of approaching horses. Eleanor felt a curious calm settle over her. The anxious energy of preparation had burned away, leaving only focused resolve. Thomas had always claimed that clarity came in moments of greatest pressure, that when options narrowed to their essence, the path forward became unmistakable. Now, facing the imminent arrival of men intent on taking everything she had left, Eleanor understood what he had meant. There was no more room for doubt or second-guessing. Only the clear, cold certainty that she would defend what was hers, whatever the cost. The rhythmic pounding of hooves grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards beneath her feet. Through the window, she caught the first glimpse of riders topping the rise to the east, a wave of men and horses silhouetted against the morning sky. They came in loose formation, dust rising beneath their horses' hooves as they approached the creek that marked the eastern boundary of Blackwood property. At the front rode Jackson Bryce, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him was Barrett, the scar on his face visible as a pale slash in the morning light. Behind them spread a line of hired guns, hardened men drawn by the promise of easy money and the reputation of the Bryce gang. Eleanor counted 15 riders in total, their weapons clearly visible even from a distance. For a moment, the approaching force hesitated at the creek's edge, perhaps sensing the unnatural stillness that had fallen over the ranch. Bryce raised a hand, signaling his men to hold position while he assessed the property through a spyglass. Eleanor knew what he would see. A seemingly deserted ranch, its buildings intact, but showing signs of the previous raid. No movement. No obvious signs of defense. Just a property apparently abandoned by its owner, ripe for the taking. It was exactly what they wanted him to think. After a brief consultation with Barrett, Bryce waved his men forward. The riders urged their mounts across the shallow creek, water splashing as they gained the opposite bank and continued toward the ranch at a steady trot. Eleanor held her breath, counting the seconds as they approached the precise spot where Ethan had buried the dynamite the previous day. The fuse had been carefully laid, ready for Jasper Calloway's signal from the stable loft. The lead riders were 20 yards from the spot when a sharp whistle cut through the morning air. A split second later, the ground erupted in a thunderous explosion that sent earth, rock, and splintered timber skyward. 2 of Bryce's men disappeared in the blast, their horses and bodies torn apart by the force of the explosion. 3 more were thrown from their mounts as the animals reared and bucked in terror. The remaining riders scattered in confusion, some retreating toward the creek, others veering south exactly as Eleanor had anticipated. Bryce himself managed to control his panicked horse, wheeling the animal around and shouting orders to his disorganized men. 5 riders followed him south, directly into the trap Eleanor and her defenders had set. "Here they come," she called to Ethan, tracking Bryce's movement through the window. "A southern approach, just as we planned." Ethan nodded, adjusting his position to better cover the yard. "Jasper and the marshal have the rest pinned down at the creek," he reported, having glimpsed the ongoing exchange of gunfire to the east. "But they'll regroup soon." Eleanor checked her aim, waiting for Bryce's party to enter the killing zone they had established between the stable and the house. The timing needed to be perfect. Too soon, and they might retreat. Too late, and they could reach cover. Bryce led his men at a gallop toward what appeared to be the safety of the ranch buildings. Only when they had committed fully to the approach, too far in to easily turn back, did Eleanor give the signal. Now, gunfire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously. Emmett Calloway and Matthew Reed opened fire from behind the barricades, their shots precise and devastating at such close range. From the house, Eleanor and Ethan added to the fusillade, creating a deadly crossfire that caught Bryce's men in the open. 2 riders fell immediately, one shot from his saddle by Emmett's rifle, another tumbling to the ground as his horse collapsed. Beneath him, the remaining 3, including Bryce and Barrett, managed to reach the partial shelter of an overturned wagon, dismounting to return fire from this precarious position. "Barrett's hit," Ethan observed, noting the man's awkward movement as he scrambled for cover. "Left shoulder, looks like." Eleanor barely acknowledged the information, her focus narrowing to the mechanics of aim, fire, reload. The familiar rhythm steadied her as chaos erupted across the yard. Gunsmoke hung in the air, acrid and thick, partially obscuring her view of the embattled outlaws. From the stable loft came the deeper report of Harris's rifle, signaling that he and Jasper were still engaged with the remaining riders near the creek. The exchange of gunfire from that direction had grown more sporadic, suggesting that the initial ambush had taken its toll on Bryce's forces. For several minutes, the battle continued in a deafening exchange of shots, Eleanor lost track of time, aware only of the immediate needs of defense, the warm brass of spent cartridges, the smooth wood of the window frame against her shoulder, the momentary gaps in gunfire that allowed for movement or repositioning. Then, abruptly, the shooting from behind the wagon ceased. Eleanor tensed, suspecting a trap rather than surrender. Her caution proved justified when a sudden movement from the southern edge of the yard caught her attention. Two of Bryce's men had circled around during the firefight and were now approaching. "The house from the blind side! Ethan!" she called in warning, already shifting position to meet this new threat. "South corner!" The young man reacted instantly, moving to cover the vulnerable approach. His shot caught the leading outlaw square in the chest, dropping him to the ground mid-stride. The second man dove for cover behind the rain barrel at the corner of the house, returning fire with wild, panicked shots that splintered the window. Frame inches from Eleanor's head. Outside, Bryce seized the opportunity provided by this distraction. He and Barrett broke from their cover, making a dash for the partially collapsed corner of the stable, where the defensive fire couldn't easily reach them. Matthew Reed spotted the movement and attempted to adjust his position, exposing himself. Momentarily in the process, Barrett's shot caught him in the side, sending him stumbling backward with a pained grunt. Emmett Calloway pulled the wounded man to safety behind the barricade, returning fire to cover their retreat. The intensity of the gunfight increased as both sides adjusted to the shifting dynamics of the battle. Eleanor felt sweat trickling down her spine, her ears ringing from the constant gunfire, but her hands remained steady as she traded shots with the outlaw behind the rain barrel. A sudden crash from the kitchen made her heart lurch. Someone had broken through the rear door. Eleanor spun, weapon raised, only to find Marshal Harris backing into the room, his rifle trained on the doorway he had just entered. "We've got a problem," he announced without preamble. "Jasper's hit. Not bad. But he can't hold the loft alone. And there's more riders coming from the north. Looks like Reynolds sent reinforcements." Eleanor's mind raced, reassessing their situation. The carefully planned defense was unraveling as new variables entered the equation. "How many?" "At least 8, maybe 10, Harris replied, firing a careful shot through the doorway before ducking back inside. "They'll be here within minutes." The odds, already precarious, had just shifted decisively against them. Eleanor's gaze swept the room, calculating. Options, escape routes, last stands. "Matthew's hit too," she informed the marshal. "We need to consolidate our defense. The house is our best position now." Harris nodded, accepting her decision without question. "I'll get Jasper. Emmett can bring Matthew. We hold here as long as possible, then use the tunnel if we have to." As the marshal disappeared back through the kitchen, Eleanor turned to Ethan. "Cover me," she instructed, moving toward the front door. "I need to signal Emmett." Ethan's eyes widened. "That's suicide. The yard is too exposed." "From the doorway," she clarified, just long enough for him to see the signal. Before Ethan could protest further, Eleanor cracked open the front door, staying low and to the side as she gave the predetermined signal. 3 short whistles that carried across the yard despite the ongoing gunfire. Emmett acknowledged with a raised hand, already helping the wounded Matthew to his feet. They would need to cross 20 yards of open ground to reach the house, a deadly prospect with Bryce and Barrett positioned to cut them down the moment they broke cover. They need covering fire, Eleanor realized, moving back to the window. "Everything we've got focused on the stable corner where Bryce is hiding." Ethan nodded, understanding immediately. "On your mark." Eleanor took a steadying breath, then called out, "Now!" They opened fire simultaneously, pouring lead toward the corner of the stable where Bryce and Barrett had taken position. The concentrated barrage forced the outlaws to duck down, temporarily unable to return fire safely. Emmett seized the opportunity, half-carrying Matthew across the exposed yard toward the house. They had covered half the distance when Barrett risked raising his head to snap off a shot. His bullet kicked up dirt at Emmett's feet, but the former ranger didn't falter, maintaining his steady progress towards safety. From the northern side of the property came the thunder of approaching hooves. The reinforcements Harris had spotted were nearly upon them. Eleanor fired her last bullet, then quickly reloaded as Emmett and Matthew finally reached the porch. Ethan rushed to help them inside, barring the door behind them as Eleanor continued to provide covering fire from the window. Matthew's wound was bleeding freely, staining his shirt crimson, but the man remained conscious, gritting his teeth against the pain. Through and through, Emmett reported, helping Matthew to a chair. Lucky shot, missed anything vital, far as I can tell. Harris appeared from the kitchen, supporting Jasper Calloway, whose left leg was wrapped in a hasty bandage. The younger Calloway brother looked pale, but determined, his rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Situation?" he asked tersely, easing himself into position by the side window. "Not good," Eleanor replied honestly. "Bryce and Barrett are holed up at the stable corner. Their survivors from the creek ambush have regrouped, and reinforcements are about to arrive from the north." The sound of gunfire outside briefly intensified, then fell into an eerie silence. Through the window, Eleanor could see Bryce emerging. From his cover, Barrett beside him. Both men appeared injured but mobile, their expressions set in grim determination as they surveyed the house where their quarry had taken refuge. Behind them, the remaining members of their original force, perhaps 5 or 6 men, gathered in a loose semicircle. And from the north, the thunder of approaching horses grew louder, signaling the imminent arrival of the reinforcements that would tip the scales decisively against the defenders. "We need to consider the tunnel," Harris suggested quietly, moving to Eleanor's side. "Get you and the wounded out while we hold them here." Eleanor shook her head, unwilling to divide their already diminished force. "We stand together," she insisted, "as long as possible." Outside, Bryce raised his voice to carry across the yard. "Mrs. Blackwood, I know you can hear me." Eleanor tensed, motioning for the others to hold their fire as she moved closer to the window, staying carefully to the side to avoid presenting a target. "This can still end without further bloodshed," Bryce continued, his tone reasonable despite the circumstances. "You're surrounded, outnumbered. There's no shame in recognizing when you're beaten." "Stalling for time," Ethan murmured, his gaze fixed on the northern approach where dust clouds signaled the reinforcements' imminent arrival. "Waiting for his backup to get into position." Eleanor nodded her agreement, but she was already considering their dwindling options. The house would become a death trap once the new arrivals surrounded it completely. The tunnel offered escape, but required time to access and navigate, time they might not have once Bryce launched a coordinated assault. And even if they escaped, what then? Reynolds would claim the property, destroy the evidence of his crimes, and continue his campaign of corruption unchecked. Everything Thomas had fought for, everything he had died for, would be lost. In that moment of stark clarity, surrounded by wounded allies and facing impossible odds, Eleanor felt the weight of doubt pressed down upon her for the first time since the conflict began. Not doubt in her cause or her resolve, but doubt in her ability to lead these men to anything but disaster. "Marshal," she said quietly, turning to Harris, "get the strongboxes from my room. The evidence needs to survive, even if we don't." Harris studied her face, reading the gravity of her decision. "Eleanor, please," she interrupted. "If nothing else, Thomas deserves justice." The marshal hesitated, then nodded, disappearing up the stairs to retrieve the critical documents. Bryce's voice came again, edged now with impatience. "I'm offering you one chance, Mrs. Blackwood. Surrender now. Walk away alive. My employer is willing to be generous. Enough money to start fresh somewhere far from here." Eleanor moved to the center of the window, finally allowing Bryce to see her. Their eyes met across the yard, predator and prey, or perhaps two forces of nature colliding with equal determination. "And if I refuse?" she called back, buying precious seconds for Harris to secure the evidence. Bryce's smile was cold. "Then we burn you out. No one walks away." He gestured to one of his men, who held up a bottle filled with liquid, a rag stuffed in its neck. "Your choice." The imminent threat of fire changed the equation dramatically. The house, constructed primarily of timber, would become an inferno within minutes if they employed such tactics. The tunnel entrance in the root cellar would be cut off, trapping them to burn or be shot while attempting escape. Harris returned, the strongboxes secured in a canvas sack. "Got them," he confirmed. "But Eleanor, there's something else you should consider." Before he could elaborate, the thunder of hooves reached its crescendo as the reinforcements topped. The rise to the north. Eleanor counted at least 8 riders, heavily armed and moving with the coordinated precision of experienced gunmen. This was it, the moment when their defense would finally be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Except something was wrong. The new arrivals weren't joining Bryce's forces. Instead, they had formed a line along the northern boundary, rifles raised not toward the house, but toward Bryce and his men. "Federal marshals!" a commanding voice bellowed across the yard. "Drop your weapons! All of you are under arrest!" Eleanor stared in disbelief as the situation transformed before her eyes. The lead rider removed his hat, revealing the silver-streaked hair of a man she recognized instantly. Judge William Carson, the senior federal magistrate for the entire territory. Beside him, the other riders now displayed badges that caught the morning light. Not reinforcements for Bryce, but a federal posse came to enforce the law. Harris chuckled softly at her expression of amazement. "Remember when I disappeared for an hour yesterday afternoon? Sent a telegram to an old friend. In the federal court." His weathered face broke into a rare smile. "Thought we might need some official backup." Outside, Bryce and his men stood frozen in confusion, caught between the defenders in the house and the line of federal marshals to their north. Barrett raised his weapon, perhaps intending to fight despite the overwhelming odds, but Bryce placed a restraining hand on his lieutenant's arm. Even the most hardened outlaw knew the difference between local lawmen who might be bribed or intimidated and federal marshals operating under direct authority from territorial judges. This was no longer a simple land grab that could be disguised as unfortunate frontier violence. This was now a federal matter with witnesses, evidence, and official scrutiny. "Smart man," Emmett observed, as Bryce slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. "Knows when he's beaten." One by one, the surviving members of Bryce's gang followed suit, placing their guns on the ground and raising their hands in surrender. Barrett was the last to comply, his scarred face twisted in frustrated rage as he finally relinquished his revolver. Judge Carson dismounted, approaching the house with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called. "Marshal Harris, it's safe to come out now." Eleanor exchanged glances with her defenders, hardly daring to believe the sudden reversal of their fortunes. Ethan looked equally stunned, his young face reflecting the disbelief they all felt. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. "Just like that?" "The shooting, maybe," Harris replied, his expression cautious despite their apparent salvation. "But Reynolds is still out there, and he's got friends in high places." Eleanor gathered herself, straightening her shoulders as she prepared to face this unexpected development. "Then we'll need to make sure the evidence reaches the right hands." She nodded toward the canvas sack containing the strongboxes, starting with Judge Carson. As they moved toward the door, battered and bloodied but alive, Eleanor felt the weight of doubt lifting from her shoulders. They had survived against impossible odds, not through force alone, but through preparation, determination, and unexpected allies. Outside, in the yard where so much blood had been spilled, federal marshals were securing Bryce and his men with iron manacles. The morning sun revealed the cost of the conflict. Bodies lying still in death, wounded men groaning, the scarred landscape of battle surrounding the house Thomas had built with such hope for the future. Yet as Eleanor stepped onto the porch, Thomas's revolvers still at her hips, she felt a sense of rightness amidst the chaos. This land, this legacy had been defended, not just with bullets, but with the same unyielding resolve that had first brought her husband to this wild territory. The battle for Blackwood Ranch was over. The fight for justice was just beginning. The Versailles Territorial Courthouse in Silverlight buzzed with anticipation, its polished oak benches filled to capacity. 2 months had passed since the battle at Blackwood Ranch. 2 months of healing, rebuilding, and preparation for this moment. Eleanor sat in the front row, her posture straight despite the lingering fatigue. Beside her was Ethan Mills, almost unrecognizable in a new suit. Samuel Parker occupied the seat on her other side, his injured arm now healed enough that he had discarded the sling. At the prosecution table, Marshal Harris conferred with Judge Carson, who had temporarily set aside his judicial role to serve as special prosecutor. The evidence they had assembled was formidable. Thomas's journals, sworn affidavits, bank records, and most damning of all, the testimony of Jackson Bryce himself. Facing multiple murder charges, Bryce had made the calculated decision to save his own neck by turning on his employer. His testimony directly linked Richard Reynolds to a dozen crimes, including Thomas Blackwood's murder. A murmur swept through the courtroom as 3 U.S. Marshals escorted Richard Reynolds inside. The cattle baron looked diminished somehow, his expensive suit hanging looser on his frame than when Eleanor had glimpsed him at social functions in the past. Reynolds' gaze eventually settled on Eleanor with an expression that mingled contempt with grudging respect. She met his stare unflinchingly, neither triumphant nor intimidated. As the proceedings continued, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the ranch. The rebuilding had begun almost immediately after the battle. A new barn, rising from the ashes of the old damaged fences repaired, scattered livestock gradually recovered. The work was far from complete, but already the property was showing signs of resilience. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan whispered during a brief recess. Eleanor's lips curved in a slight smile. "Just thinking about how much we've accomplished already, and how much we still have to do," Ethan added, the "we" coming naturally now. In the weeks since the battle, the young man had proven himself invaluable, working from dawn until dusk on repairs, handling ranch affairs when Eleanor needed to be in town for legal matters. As they filed out for the midday recess, a hand touched Eleanor's elbow. She turned to find herself face to face with Claire Reynolds, Richard's wife. "Mrs. Blackwood," Claire greeted her, voice low. "Might I have a moment?" Curiosity overcame caution, and Eleanor nodded, allowing Claire to guide her to a quiet alcove. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Claire began, her gloved hands clasped tightly. "To express my sincere regret for what has happened. For your husband's death, for the attack on your property, for all of it." Eleanor studied her carefully, searching for artifice and finding none. "You knew?" she asked quietly. "Not at first. Richard was always careful to shield me from his business affairs." A bitter smile touched her lips. "After your husband's death, I found papers, correspondence with Mr. Bryce that made certain matters unmistakably clear." Claire straightened, something resolute entering her expression. "I will be testifying for the prosecution tomorrow. Richard doesn't know yet." She withdrew a folded document from her reticule. "I have letters that directly connect Richard to your husband's murder. I've already provided copies to Judge Carson, but I thought you deserved to see them first." Eleanor accepted the documents, momentarily stunned. "This is significant." "It will destroy him," Claire acknowledged, a strange calm settling over her features, "as he destroyed others." The next week passed in a blur of testimony. Eleanor took the stand and recounted the events leading to the battle at Blackwood Ranch. Marshal Harris testified to Thomas's character and Reynolds' corrupt influence throughout the territory, but it was Claire Reynolds' testimony that electrified the courtroom. Speaking in a clear, unwavering voice, she detailed years of her husband's illegal activities, conversations she had overheard, documents she had discovered, direct admissions Reynolds had made when he believed her loyalty absolute. On the morning of the 10th day, as the prosecution prepared to call its final witnesses, a commotion in the courthouse corridor disrupted proceedings. The bailiff hurried to investigate, returning to whisper something to the judge. "This court will recess for 1 hour," Judge Henderson announced abruptly. Marshal Harris made his way to Eleanor's side. "Reynolds tried to hang himself in his cell this morning," he informed her quietly. "They got him down in time, but he's asking to change his plea." "He's seeking mercy?" Eleanor asked. "More likely trying to avoid complete public humiliation," Harris replied. "He's offering a full confession in exchange for avoiding the gallows." When court reconvened, Judge Henderson confirmed that Richard Reynolds had changed his plea to guilty on all counts, providing a written confession that implicated numerous territorial officials. In exchange, the death penalty would be removed. "From consideration, the defendant will be sentenced 1 week from today," Henderson announced, his severe expression suggesting Reynolds would receive the maximum penalty available short of hanging. As the spectators filed out, Eleanor remained, seated, experiencing a curious sense of anticlimactic completion. "It's over," Ethan said softly beside her. "Really over." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak immediately. The weight she had carried since Thomas's death hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted somehow, becoming less crushing. "What happens now?" Samuel asked. "Now," Eleanor replied, finding her voice, "we go home and finish rebuilding." The Blackwood Ranch looked dramatically different 3 months after the battle. The new barn stood proud and solid, larger than its predecessor. The house had been repaired, broken windows replaced, bullet holes plastered over and painted. In the south pasture, cattle grazed peacefully. The beginning of a new herd, purchased with funds from the sale of smaller land parcels Eleanor had decided weren't essential to the ranch's operations. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching as Ethan worked with 2 new ranch hands in the corral, breaking a spirited Mustang. "He's got a gift," Samuel observed, joining her with 2 cups of coffee. "Reminds me of Thomas when he first started out." Eleanor accepted the coffee with a small smile. "He's finding his place. We all are." The aftermath of Reynolds' conviction had brought significant changes to the territory. Several officials implicated in his confession had resigned or faced charges. The territorial bank had undergone a complete restructuring under federal oversight, and Blackwood Ranch, once targeted for its valuable resources, was now recognized as the cornerstone of a new, more transparent approach to development in the region. Marshal Harris sent a letter, Samuel mentioned. "Says the first oil derrick should be operational within 6 months. The governors, honoring the contract Thomas negotiated." The sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. A rider was approaching from the main road, Claire Reynolds, dressed in practical riding attire. "I invited her," Eleanor explained to Samuel's questioning look. "She's selling most of her husband's holdings and returning east. Wanted to see the ranch before she left." As they walked the property, Claire listened with the attention of someone preparing to embark on her own new beginning. "I've finalized the sale of the Reynolds mansion," she mentioned as they paused by the creek. "The proceeds will establish a fund for homesteaders affected by Richard's schemes. It seems a fitting use for his ill-gotten gains." "And you? What will you do now?" Eleanor asked. "Return to Philadelphia initially, but eventually—" She smiled slightly. "I've purchased a small property in Massachusetts. Nothing grand, just a cottage near the shore. Sounds peaceful, Eleanor observed. "After all this, peace is exactly what I'm seeking." Claire turned to face her directly. "I wanted to thank you, Eleanor, not just for your graciousness during the trial, but for standing firm when it would have been easier to surrender. Your courage reminded me that we always have choices, even when they seem impossible." Later, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Eleanor sat on the porch with Samuel and Ethan. The three enjoyed companionable silence as the sky painted itself in shades of orange and pink. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, finally. "The north pasture would be perfect for a house of your own, Ethan. Nothing elaborate, but somewhere you could put down roots if you're planning to stay on permanently." The young man looked startled, then deeply moved. "Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor," she corrected gently. "After everything we've been through, I think we're well past formalities." Ethan smiled, the expression transforming his youthful features. "Eleanor, then. And yes, I'd like that very much. Thomas always said Blackwood Ranch was meant to be more than just a cattle operation," she replied. "He envisioned a place where people could build futures, where hard work and loyalty meant something." Her gaze swept across the property that had nearly been taken from her, the land she had defended with warning shots that proved to be precisely where she had aimed them. "I think we're well on our way to fulfilling that vision." As darkness settled over the ranch, Eleanor felt a sense of completion that transcended the justice served in the courthouse or even the rebuilding of what had been damaged. This land, this legacy, had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, just as she had. The widow who had once been underestimated by men like Jackson Bryce and Richard Reynolds was now recognized throughout the territory as a force to be reckoned with, not just for her skill with a revolver, but for her unwavering determination to defend what was rightfully hers. Thomas would have been proud. And perhaps, Eleanor thought, as she gazed at the first stars appearing in the evening sky, he somehow knew. Perhaps he had always known what she was capable of, even before she discovered it herself. In the end, that was the greatest legacy he had left her, not the land or its hidden wealth, but the conviction that some things were worth fighting for, worth staking everything on a precisely aimed warning shot that said more clearly than words ever could, "This far and no further." Eleanor Blackwood had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose, and that, more than justice or vengeance, was the true victory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.